Long before the dragon-prowed ships carved their names into history, before the first monastery trembled at the sight of northern sails, there existed a land wrapped in ice and shadow. The Scandinavian peninsula stretched like a sleeping giant between two seas, its spine formed by mountains that scraped the belly of winter clouds. This was a realm where the sun barely kissed the horizon during the darkest months, where ancient glaciers had carved deep fjords into the coastline like the claws of some primordial beast. In these northern reaches, perhaps 12,000 years ago, the first humans followed the retreating ice. They came as hunters, tracking reindeer across tundra that slowly gave way to birch and pine forests. These earliest inhabitants left their marks in stone, carved pictures of elk and boats, simple lines that would echo through millennia. The land shaped them as surely as water shapes stone, teaching patience through long winters and resilience through scarcity. The Bronze Age brought transformation to these northern peoples around 1700 BCE. Trade routes opened like veins across Europe, carrying amber south and bronze north. The inhabitants of Scandinavia learned to work this new metal into weapons and ornaments, creating spiral patterns that seemed to capture the movement of water and wind. They built burial mounds for their chiefs, great earthen monuments that dotted the landscape like sleeping bears. Inside these mounds, they placed ships made of stone, outlining vessels that would carry the dead to whatever realm awaited beyond the veil of life. These Bronze Age Scandinavians were already sailors, though their boats were nothing like the vessels that would one day terrorize European coasts. They paddled skin boats and dugout canoes through the archipelagos that scattered like broken pottery along the Swedish and Norwegian coasts. Each journey taught them the moods of the North Sea and the Baltic, the way storms could rise from nothing, the patterns of currents that could carry a boat to safety or dash it against rocks. The sun itself became a central symbol in their emerging mythology. They carved its image on bronze razors and rock faces, a wheel of light rolling across the sky. In the endless summer days when the sun barely set, they must have felt its power most keenly. In winter, when darkness pressed down like a physical weight, they told stories of its journey through the underworld, pulled by horses through realms of shadow until it could rise again. Farming came slowly to these northern lands, fighting for space against forest and rock. The first agricultural communities appeared around 4000 BCE, but even by the time of the Bronze Age, farming remained a constant struggle against the elements. They grew barley that could withstand short summers and sudden frosts. They raised cattle and sheep, animals that needed shelter through the long winters, creating a cycle of labor that bound communities together through necessity. The social structure that emerged from these challenges would echo through Viking society centuries later. Leaders were those who could provide in lean times, who could organize the community for survival. Warriors were necessary not just for raids, but for protection against neighboring groups competing for the same scarce resources. The harsh environment created a meritocracy of sorts, where skill and strength mattered more than inherited wealth, though family connections always carried weight. Around 500 BCE, iron began to replace bronze, ushered in not through trade, but through local production. The Scandinavians learned to extract iron from bog ore, a resource that lay hidden in their marshes and wetlands. This democratization of metal changed everything. Where bronze had been precious, controlled by those who controlled trade, iron could be made by anyone with the knowledge and patience to work it. Weapons became more common, tools more sturdy, and the possibilities for both creation and destruction multiplied. The Iron Age Scandinavians developed a runic alphabet, adapted from Mediterranean scripts but transformed into something uniquely their own. These angular marks, designed to be carved into wood and stone, carried messages, marked ownership, and perhaps held magical significance. The runes would become one of the most enduring symbols of Norse culture, a writing system that seemed to capture the harsh beauty of the northern landscape in its very shape. Villages grew larger and more permanent during this period. Longhouses emerged as the dominant architectural form, structures that could shelter extended families, their livestock, and their supplies through the darkest months. These buildings, sometimes stretching over 30 meters in length, became the centers of social life. Around the central hearth, families would gather to eat, work, and tell stories while snow piled against the walls outside. The mythology that would become so central to Viking identity began to crystallize during these centuries. The gods took shape from older animistic beliefs, transforming from spirits of place into personalities with names and stories. Odin, the wanderer and wisdom seeker, emerged from earlier traditions of shamanic practice. Thor, with his hammer and his strength, embodied the force needed to survive in a hostile world. Freya and Freya represented fertility and abundance, the dreams of every farming community. These gods were not distant, perfect beings, but flawed, struggling figures who faced their own doom with courage. The concept of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, reflected a worldview shaped by harsh winters and uncertain survival. Even the gods would die, the stories said, but they would face their end with honor. This fatalistic courage would become a defining characteristic of Viking culture, the idea that doom was inevitable, but how one faced it mattered immensely. Trade networks during the Iron Age grew increasingly sophisticated. Scandinavian traders traveled south to the Roman Empire, exchanging furs, amber, and slaves for wine, glass, and silver. Roman coins found their way into Scandinavian soil, buried in hoards that suggest both wealth and insecurity. The exposure to Roman culture and wealth would plant seeds of ambition that would fully flower in the Viking Age. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE created a power vacuum that would eventually draw Scandinavian attention southward. But first, the northern peoples had their own upheavals to navigate. The migration period, roughly from 400 to 550 CE, saw massive population movements across Europe. Some Scandinavian groups moved south, the Goths and Vandals, whose names would become synonymous with the fall of Rome. Others stayed, absorbing new influences from the changing ethnic landscape around them. This period of movement and mixture created a cultural ferment in Scandinavia. New artistic styles emerged, particularly the intricate animal ornamentation that would become a hallmark of Viking art. Smiths learned to create pattern-welded blades, the so-called Damascus steel of the north, with serpentine patterns that seemed to writhe along the length of the sword. These weapons were more than tools, they were works of art, often given names and passed down through generations like family members. The political landscape of Scandinavia during the 6th and 7th centuries remained fragmented. Petty kingdoms rose and fell with the fortunes of their leaders. A successful war leader might control several valleys or coastal districts, but death or defeat could scatter these small empires like seeds on the wind. This constant competition created a warrior culture where young men sought glory and wealth through violence, whether in service to their local chief or in small-scale raids on neighboring territories. Ships evolved steadily during these centuries, though the revolutionary designs of the Viking Age had not yet emerged. Scandinavian shipbuilders experimented with different hull shapes, learning to create vessels that could navigate both rivers and open ocean. They developed the clinker-built technique, overlapping planks that created strong, flexible hulls that could flex with the waves rather than fighting them. The addition of sails, probably adopted from Frisian or Anglo-Saxon models, transformed these vessels from coastal craft to true ocean-going ships. The religious practices of pre-Viking Scandinavia centered on sacrifice and reciprocity. Gods and spirits required offerings to ensure good harvests, successful raids, and protection from enemies. These sacrifices ranged from simple food offerings to elaborate ceremonies involving animals and occasionally humans. Bog bodies discovered across Scandinavia, perfectly preserved in peat, may represent some of these sacrificial victims, though their exact purpose remains debated. Sacred spaces dotted the landscape, groves of trees, unusual rock formations, and springs all might serve as points of connection between the human world and the realm of gods and spirits. The Uppsala temple in Sweden, described by later medieval writers, supposedly contained statues of Odin, Thor, and Freya, and hosted elaborate sacrificial ceremonies every 9 years. While the exact nature of these practices remains uncertain, they clearly formed a central part of pre-Viking Scandinavian life. The role of women in this society was complex and often contradictory. While excluded from most forms of political power, women controlled the domestic sphere and its economy. They managed households that might include dozens of people, oversaw textile production that created both clothing and trade goods, and served as priestesses in religious ceremonies. The keys that married women wore as symbols of their authority over the household would become one of the most common grave goods of the Viking Age. Slavery existed in Scandinavian society long before the Viking Age. Slaves, or thralls, performed much of the agricultural labor and household work. They might be captured in raids, purchased from traders, or born into bondage. The institution of slavery would become one of the economic drivers of Viking expansion, as raiders sought captives to work their farms or sell in international slave markets. The climate of Scandinavia underwent significant changes in the centuries before the Viking Age. A warming period that began around 800 CE made agriculture more viable in marginal areas. Growing seasons lengthened, harvests improved, and populations increased. This demographic pressure would become one of the factors pushing Scandinavians to seek new lands and opportunities beyond their traditional borders. Technological innovations accumulated steadily. Scandinavian smiths perfected techniques for creating high-quality iron and steel. They learned to build more efficient kilns and forges, to create complex pattern-welded blades, and to mass-produce standardized tools and weapons. Agricultural improvements included better plows, more efficient harvesting tools, and improved storage techniques that allowed communities to survive longer winters and support larger populations. The intellectual culture of pre-Viking Scandinavia is harder to trace but no less significant. The runic inscriptions that survive suggest a society with widespread, if basic, literacy. The complex poetry that would be preserved in later Icelandic manuscripts had its roots in this period, with elaborate kennings and intricate metrical patterns that required both creativity and deep cultural knowledge to compose and understand. Legal traditions developed to manage increasingly complex societies. Assemblies where free men gathered to settle disputes and make collective decisions, emerged as a central institution. These assemblies combined legal, political, and religious functions, serving as courts, parliaments, and sacred spaces. The idea that law came from the community rather than being imposed by rulers would remain a fundamental aspect of Scandinavian culture throughout the Viking Age. As the 8th century drew to a close, all the elements that would create the Viking Age were in place. The Scandinavians had the ships to reach distant shores, the weapons to take what they wanted, the demographic pressure to seek new opportunities, and the cultural values that celebrated boldness and violence. They had been testing these tools on each other for generations, raiding across the Baltic and along the Norwegian coast in a constant low-level warfare that honed skills and identified leaders. The monasteries of Britain and Ireland, wealthy and poorly defended, lay within easy reach of Scandinavian sailors who had learned every mood of the North Sea. Continental Europe, fragmented after the collapse of Roman authority and struggling with its own internal conflicts, could offer little coordinated resistance to fast-moving raiders who struck from the sea and disappeared before any response could be organized. The stage was set for transformation. The northern mists that had long shrouded Scandinavia from the view of literate Europe were about to part, revealing not the barbarian savages of later imagination, but a complex society of farmers, traders, craftsmen, and warriors. These were people shaped by their harsh landscape into something resilient and adaptable, capable of both terrible violence and surprising sophistication. What emerged from those mists in the final years of the 8th century would reshape Europe and beyond. The Viking Age was not a sudden explosion, but the culmination of centuries of development, a moment when all the threads of Scandinavian culture came together to create something new and terrifying to those who encountered it. The dragon ships that would soon prowl every sea from Greenland to the Caspian were the products of generations of innovation. The warriors who wielded their pattern-welded swords with such devastating effect were heirs to a martial tradition that stretched back to the Bronze Age. The morning of June 8, 793, dawned like any other over the holy island of Lindisfarne. Monks rose for their morning prayers, their voices carrying across the tidal flats that connected the island to the Northumbrian coast. The monastery, founded over a century earlier by St. Aidan, had become one of the great centres of Christian learning in northern Europe. Its scriptorium produced illuminated manuscripts of breathtaking beauty, its scholars corresponded with Rome and Ireland, and its treasury held gifts from pilgrims and nobles seeking salvation. The first sign of danger might have been birds rising suddenly from the shoreline, or perhaps the glint of sun on metal where no metal should be. The monks who witnessed the approach of the strange ships would have had no context for what they saw. These vessels moved differently from the trading ships that occasionally visited, their shallow drafts allowing them to ground directly on the beach, rather than anchoring offshore. The men who leaped from these ships into the shallow water moved with practiced efficiency, forming into groups without shouted orders or confusion. What followed was swift and brutal. The raiders showed no respect for the sanctity of the church, no fear of divine retribution. They stripped altars of their gold and silver vessels, gathered books whose jeweled covers were worth more than their holy words to these pagans, and seized any monk young and healthy enough to bring a good price in the slave markets. Those who resisted were cut down. The church that had stood as a beacon of civilization on this remote shore was reduced to a smoking ruin. The shock that rippled through Christian Europe was as much psychological as material. Alcuin of York, the great scholar at Charlemagne's court, wrote in horror of how the Church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its ornament. The violation of sacred space by pagans seemed to herald the approaching end times. How could God allow such desecration? What sins had Christians committed to deserve such punishment? Yet from the Scandinavian perspective, the raid on Lindisfarne was simply the logical extension of practices that had been developing for generations. Population growth in Scandinavia had created pressure on limited agricultural land. The system of inheritance that favoured eldest sons left younger siblings with few options beyond seeking their fortunes elsewhere. The same warming climate that had improved Scandinavian agriculture had also made sea travel more predictable, with fewer severe storms and more navigable conditions. The development of the sail in Scandinavian ships during the 7th and 8th centuries had transformed these vessels from coastal craft to true instruments of power projection. The classic Viking longship represented a perfect balance of competing demands. It needed to be strong enough to survive North Atlantic storms, yet light enough for portage. It had to carry sufficient warriors to overwhelm local resistance, but remain fast enough to escape pursuit. The shallow draft that allowed these ships to navigate rivers also made them ideal for beach landings. The construction of these vessels required enormous skill and resources. A medium-sized longship might require the wood from 12 large oak trees, carefully selected for grain and strength. The keel was laid first, a single massive timber that formed the backbone of the ship. Ribs were attached to this keel, then planks were fitted using the clinker method, each overlapping the one below and fastened with iron rivets. The resulting hull was both strong and flexible, able to ride waves that would break a more rigid vessel. The sail, a relatively recent addition to Scandinavian ships, was a square of woolen cloth, often reinforced with leather strips in a diamond pattern. This sail could drive a longship at speeds approaching 15 knots under ideal conditions. When wind failed or precision maneuvering was required, oars provided power. A typical longship might have 15 to 20 oar positions per side, each manned by a warrior who was as comfortable rowing as fighting. Navigation across open water required skills passed down through generations. Viking navigators learned to read the patterns of waves, understanding how swells changed when approaching land. They watched the flight patterns of seabirds, knowing which species stayed close to shore and which ranged far out to sea. The color of water told them about depth and proximity to river mouths. Cloud formations revealed invisible islands beyond the horizon, and the behavior of whales and seals indicated currents and feeding grounds that often corresponded with underwater features. At night, or in fog, navigation became more challenging, but not impossible. The Vikings understood the movement of stars using the pole star when visible, and other celestial markers when it was not. They may have possessed crystals that could polarize light, allowing them to determine the sun's position even through clouds, though this remains debated among historians. What is certain is that Viking navigators routinely made voyages that would challenge modern sailors in similar vessels. The success at Lindisfarne opened floodgates of opportunity. Word spread quickly through Scandinavian trading networks of the wealth available in Christian monasteries and the ease with which it could be taken. The Christian reluctance to fight on holy days, their concentration of wealth in undefended religious sites, and the speed with which Viking raiders could strike and withdraw made monasteries ideal targets. The following year, 794, saw raids on the monastery at Jarrow, also in Northumbria, and on Iona in Scotland. In 795, Vikings struck Ireland for the first time, raiding islands off the coast before withdrawing with their plunder. Each successful raid encouraged more. Young men who might have spent their lives farming marginal land or serving as retainers to local lords now saw an opportunity for wealth and adventure. The early raids followed a predictable pattern. Small fleets, perhaps 3 to 6 ships carrying between 100 and 200 warriors, would depart from Norwegian fjords or Danish islands in late spring. They sailed direct routes when possible, but were perfectly capable of island hopping when necessary. The warriors aboard these ships were not professional soldiers, but farmers and craftsmen seeking supplementary income. They brought their own weapons and armor, expecting to share in whatever plunder was taken. Upon reaching their target coastline, raiders looked for isolated religious communities, wealthy trading posts, or prosperous agricultural settlements. The ideal target was close enough to the sea to allow quick access, but isolated enough to prevent rapid reinforcement. Surprise was essential. Vikings preferred to attack at dawn, when defenders were least prepared, or during religious festivals when potential warriors might be drunk or distracted. The violence of these raids was calculated rather than mindless. Vikings understood that terror was a weapon as effective as any sword. Communities that heard of atrocities committed elsewhere might pay tribute rather than resist. Monasteries that knew of the fate of Lindisfarne might flee at the first sight of dragon-prowed ships, leaving their treasures undefended. The psychological impact multiplied the effectiveness of relatively small raiding forces. Yet not all interactions between Vikings and their targets involved violence. Even during this early period, Vikings traded as often as they raided. The same ship that carried warriors could carry trade goods. Many Vikings spent summers alternating between trading and raiding, depending on opportunities and local resistance. A merchant who was cheated might return as a raider. A raider who encountered strong resistance might attempt to trade instead. The impact of these early raids on Scandinavian society was profound. Successful raiders returned home with silver, gold, and high-status goods that disrupted traditional social hierarchies. A younger son who might have lived his entire life in his elder brother's shadow could return from a single, successful raiding season with enough wealth to buy land, attract followers, and establish himself as a significant local leader. This social mobility, almost impossible within traditional Scandinavian society, became one of the major drivers of Viking expansion. The goods flowing back to Scandinavia from these raids transformed material culture. Irish metalwork influenced Scandinavian artistic styles. Frankish swords became prized possessions, often decorated with Scandinavian hilts. Christian religious objects were melted down for their precious metals or repurposed in ways their creators never intended. A gospel book cover might become part of a shield decoration, its garnets and gold retaining their beauty, if not their sacred meaning. Slavery became an increasingly important part of the Viking economy during this period. Monasteries provided educated slaves who could serve as scribes and administrators. Irish and Anglo-Saxon women were prized as concubines and household workers. The slave trade created its own momentum, as raiders sought human cargo as eagerly as silver. Dublin would later become one of the largest slave markets in Europe, a dark testament to Viking entrepreneurship. The religious dimension of these early raids cannot be ignored. While economic opportunism was the primary driver, some Vikings saw themselves as warriors of the old gods striking back against the encroaching white Christ. Christian missionaries had been active in Scandinavia for generations, often with the support of kings who saw Christianity as a path to closer ties with European powers. Traditional believers might have viewed raids on monasteries as divinely sanctioned attacks on a rival religion. The response of European kingdoms to these early raids was initially confused and ineffective. The Vikings exploited political divisions, striking where authority was weakest. In Ireland, perpetual warfare between rival kingdoms meant that some Irish lords actually welcomed Viking attacks on their enemies. In England, the kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia were more concerned with each other than with occasional coastal raids. Defensive measures were slow to develop. Building fortifications required resources and organization that many communities lacked. Maintaining standing forces to guard coastlines was expensive and often politically impossible. The speed and unpredictability of Viking attacks made traditional defensive strategies ineffective. By the time a local lord gathered his forces, the raiders were gone. Some communities attempted to buy off raiders with tribute, a strategy that provided temporary relief but encouraged future attacks. The Vikings quickly learned which communities would pay and how much they could afford. This protection money, later formalized as Danegeld, became a regular source of income for Viking leaders and a crushing burden for European communities. The Church's response combined practical and spiritual measures. Monks began building round towers in Ireland, structures that served as both bell towers and refuges during attacks. Precious objects were hidden or moved inland. Prayers were amended to include protection from Viking raids. "From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us," became a common refrain in liturgies across northern Europe. Yet even as they prayed for deliverance, some churchmen recognized that the Vikings might be instruments of divine punishment. Alcuin and others interpreted the raids as God's judgment on a sinful Christian society. This theological interpretation complicated responses to Viking attacks. If the raids were divine punishment, was resistance opposing God's will? Such questions paralyzed decision-making at crucial moments. The technology of warfare evolved rapidly during this period. Vikings encountered different fighting styles and defensive strategies across Europe, adapting their techniques accordingly. The round shields and pattern-welded swords they brought from Scandinavia proved effective against the weapons they encountered. Viking armor, typically mail shirts for wealthy warriors and leather for common fighters, provided adequate protection while maintaining mobility. The psychological profile of Viking raiders emerged during these early years. They were pragmatic rather than ideological, willing to adopt whatever tactics brought success. They showed remarkable discipline in combat, maintaining shield walls under pressure and executing complex maneuvers that required extensive training. Yet they were also capable of berserk fury, the battle madness that gave rise to legends of unstoppable Viking warriors. The role of women in supporting these early raids was significant, if often invisible. Women managed farms and households during the raiding season, ensuring that agricultural work continued despite the absence of many men. They processed and preserved the food that provisioned raiding expeditions. They wove the sails that powered longships and the clothes that kept warriors warm during North Sea crossings. Some women participated more directly in Viking expansion. Evidence suggests that some raids included female warriors, though their numbers and roles remain debated. More commonly, women traveled as settlers once raiders had identified suitable lands for colonization. They brought Scandinavian domestic culture to new territories, establishing households that replicated homeland patterns in foreign soil. The economic impact of early Viking raids extended far beyond the immediate plunder. The threat of raids disrupted trade routes, increased transportation costs, and diverted resources from productive activities to defense. Monasteries that had served as centers of learning and economic production became fortified strongholds or were abandoned entirely. The intellectual flowering of the Northumbrian Renaissance ended abruptly, its scholars scattered or killed. Yet the Viking impact was not entirely destructive. The movement of goods, even stolen ones, created new economic networks. Viking traders followed raiders, establishing commercial relationships that would endure for centuries. Technologies and ideas flowed in both directions. Vikings adopted useful innovations from their victims while introducing their own shipbuilding and navigation techniques to European maritime culture. The early Viking raids also accelerated political centralization in Europe. The threat of Viking attacks forced small kingdoms to cooperate or be absorbed by stronger neighbors. Leaders who could effectively defend against Vikings gained legitimacy and support. The eventual emergence of unified kingdoms in England, Scotland, and Ireland was partly a response to Viking pressure. As the 9th century progressed, the nature of Viking activity began to change. What had started as seasonal raiding by small groups evolved into larger, more organized expeditions. Some Vikings began to overwinter in target territories rather than returning home each autumn. Temporary camps became fortified bases from which Vikings could launch raids deeper inland. This evolution from raiding to occupation marked a crucial transition. Vikings were no longer merely taking wealth from Europe. They were beginning to see themselves as potential rulers of European territories. The skills that made them successful raiders, mobility, aggression, and tactical flexibility, would soon be applied to conquest and state building. The decade following Lindisfarne established patterns that would define the Viking Age. The combination of superior maritime technology, tactical innovation, and social pressures created a perfect storm of expansion. Europeans learned to fear the dragon-prowed ships that appeared without warning from the morning mist. Vikings learned that their southern neighbors possessed wealth beyond imagination and the weakness to have it taken. The transformation of Viking activity from opportunistic raiding to systematic conquest began gradually in the early decades of the 9th century. Where once a dozen ships might have appeared off a coastline for a few days of plunder, now fleets of 50 or even 100 vessels arrived with different intentions. The warriors aboard these ships brought tools for building as well as weapons for fighting. They carried seeds for planting and livestock for breeding. Most significantly, they brought their families. The shift started in Ireland, where Vikings recognized opportunities beyond simple theft. The island's political fragmentation, with dozens of competing kingdoms and no unified resistance, created ideal conditions for establishing permanent bases. In 841, Vikings founded a fortified camp at the mouth of the River Liffey, a location that would grow into the city of Dublin. This was not merely a raiding base, but an emerging trade centre, strategically positioned to control commerce between Ireland and the broader Viking world. Similar bases appeared at Cork, Waterford, Wexford, and Limerick. These long forts, as the Irish called them, served multiple functions. They provided secure harbours for Viking fleets, fortified positions from which to launch raids inland, and increasingly sophisticated centres for manufacturing and trade. Irish slaves, cattle, and metalwork flowed through these ports to Scandinavia and beyond, while silver, weapons, and luxury goods moved in the opposite direction. The Vikings who established these bases began to engage with Irish politics in complex ways. They formed alliances with Irish kings against their enemies, married into Irish noble families, and adopted elements of Irish culture even as they maintained their Scandinavian identity. Some Vikings became so integrated into Irish society that they fought against newly arrived Viking raiders, defending their adopted territories from their own kinsmen. This pattern of integration and adaptation would repeat across Europe, but nowhere more dramatically than in England. For decades after Lindisfarne, Vikings had treated England as a source of portable wealth, raiding monasteries and trading centres before retreating to Scandinavia or their Irish bases. This changed dramatically in 865 with the arrival of what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called the Great Heathen Army. This was not a raiding party, but an invasion force. Perhaps 3,000 warriors carried in over 100 ships. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claims the army was led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, seeking vengeance for their father's death in a Northumbrian snake pit. Whether Ragnar was a historical figure or a composite of various Viking leaders matters less than what his supposed sons accomplished. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, and Ubba led a force that would fundamentally reshape the British Isles. The Great Army's strategy differed markedly from previous Viking operations. Rather than attacking coastal targets and withdrawing, they penetrated deep inland using Roman roads and river systems. They moved faster than defending armies could respond, striking where resistance was weakest and avoiding pitched battles unless victory was assured. Most innovatively, they learned to use horses for rapid movement, though they still fought on foot in the Scandinavian tradition. Landing in East Anglia in autumn 865, the Vikings did something unprecedented. Instead of raiding, they negotiated with the East Anglian King Edmund, accepting tribute and horses in exchange for leaving his kingdom temporarily unharmed. This gave them a secure base and mobility for their next moves. They wintered in East Anglia, using the time to gather intelligence, recruit additional warriors, and plan their campaign. In 866, the Great Army moved north to York, the ancient capital of Northumbria. They timed their attack perfectly, arriving when Northumbria was torn by civil war between two rival kings. York fell almost without resistance on November 1st, 866, All Saints' Day, when most of the city's defenders were attending church services. The Vikings fortified the old Roman walls and established York, or Jorvik as they called it, as their principal base in northern England. The Northumbrian kings temporarily set aside their differences to attempt recapturing York in March 867. The battle was a disaster for the Anglo-Saxons. Both kings died along with much of the Northumbrian nobility. The Vikings installed a puppet king and controlled Northumbria through him, establishing a pattern of indirect rule they would employ repeatedly. Local administration continued much as before, but ultimate authority rested with Viking warlords. From York, the Great Army struck south into Mercia, the powerful Midland kingdom that had long dominated English politics. The Mercians, led by King Burgred, attempted to buy off the Vikings as the East Anglians had. The Vikings accepted tribute but used the respite to strengthen their position rather than withdraw. They established a fortified camp at Nottingham, from which they could threaten both Mercia and Wessex. King Aethelred of Wessex and his younger brother Alfred attempted to support the Mercians but found the Viking position at Nottingham too strong to assault. The Vikings had learned to construct sophisticated fortifications, combining their own techniques with Roman and Anglo-Saxon methods. These camps, surrounded by ditches and palisades, were nearly impregnable to the warfare techniques of the period. Returning to York in 869, the great army split temporarily. Part of the force remained to consolidate control over Northumbria, while the remainder returned to East Anglia. King Edmund, who had provided horses and tribute 4 years earlier, now attempted resistance. The resulting conflict ended with Edmund's capture and execution, allegedly by the Blood Eagle, a ritualistic form of execution that may be more legend than history. Edmund's martyrdom would make him one of medieval England's most venerated saints, but his death left East Anglia under complete Viking control. The organizational structure of the Great Army revealed sophisticated military thinking. Unlike traditional Germanic war bands held together by personal loyalty to individual leaders, the Great Army operated more like a professional military force. Warriors swore oaths to the army itself rather than just to individual commanders. Plunder was distributed according to established rules, with shares determined by rank and contribution to victories. This structure allowed the army to absorb local recruits, including Anglo-Saxons willing to fight for Viking silver. The Great Army was never purely Scandinavian. Irish Vikings, Frisians, and even Frankish adventurers joined its ranks. This diversity brought different fighting techniques and local knowledge that enhanced the army's effectiveness. Some English nobles, seeing the political winds shifting, allied themselves with the Vikings and profited from the new order. The army's intelligence network was remarkably sophisticated. Vikings cultivated informants in Anglo-Saxon courts, monasteries, and trading centers. They knew about political divisions, defensive weaknesses, and the location of portable wealth. This intelligence allowed them to strike precisely where and when their enemies were most vulnerable. The speed and accuracy of their attacks suggest detailed advance planning based on reliable information. In 870, the Great Army faced its most serious challenge yet when it invaded Wessex, the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom of significant power. Wessex had used the years of Viking focus on northern England to prepare its defences. King Aethelred and his brother Alfred had studied Viking tactics and developed countermeasures. They had also used diplomatic marriage alliances to secure support from Cornwall and Wales. The campaign of 871 saw more battles between Vikings and Anglo-Saxons than any previous year. The armies met at Reading, where Vikings had fortified a position between the Thames and Kennet rivers. The initial Anglo-Saxon assault failed, but 4 days later at Ashdown, Alfred led a charge that broke the Viking shield wall, killing 5 Jarls and forcing the invaders to retreat. It was the first significant Viking defeat in open battle. Yet Viking resilience proved remarkable. Within 2 weeks they had regrouped and defeated the Anglo-Saxons at Basing. 2 months later they won again at Meritun. The campaign demonstrated that while Vikings could be defeated tactically, their strategic position remained strong. They could afford losses that would destroy Anglo-Saxon armies. When King Aethelred died in April 871, probably from battle wounds, the 22-year-old Alfred inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Alfred, later known as the Great, recognized that Wessex could not defeat the Vikings through conventional warfare. Instead, he negotiated a peace, paying substantial tribute to make the Vikings withdraw. This payment, later formalized as Danegeld, bought time rather than security. Alfred used this respite to reform Wessex's military system, creating a network of fortified towns called burhs and organizing a rotation system that kept part of his army always ready for service. Meanwhile, the Great Army turned its attention to Mercia. King Burgred, who had managed to maintain nominal independence through tribute payments, was driven into exile in 874. The Vikings installed a puppet king, Ceolwulf, described contemptuously by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as a foolish king's thegn. Mercia was effectively partitioned, with Vikings taking the eastern portions while Ceolwulf administered the west under Viking oversight. At this point, something remarkable happened. The Great Army, which had operated as a unified force for nearly a decade, divided permanently. Halfdan led part of the army north to consolidate control over Northumbria, while Guthrum, or Settel, and Anwend led the remainder to continue campaigning in southern England. This division reflected changing Viking priorities. After years of campaigning, many warriors were ready to settle down and enjoy their conquered lands. The settlement process in Northumbria provides insight into Viking colonization methods. Halfdan shared out the lands of Northumbria, and they were engaged in ploughing and in making a living for themselves, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This brief notice describes a profound transformation. Warriors became farmers, though they remained ready to fight when necessary. They took over existing Anglo-Saxon estates or established new settlements on previously marginal land. Viking settlement patterns varied by region. In some areas, they completely displaced the Anglo-Saxon population. Place name evidence shows dense Scandinavian settlement in parts of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, with names ending in by, Thorpe, and Thwaite marking Viking farms and villages. In other regions, Vikings formed a warrior aristocracy ruling over Anglo-Saxon farmers. DNA evidence from modern populations suggests significant Scandinavian genetic contribution in former Viking areas, indicating substantial migration rather than just elite replacement. The legal systems in Viking-controlled areas blended Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon traditions. The Vikings brought their own concepts of law, including forms of legal procedure and punishment unknown in England. They established thing assemblies where free men could participate in legal proceedings. Yet they also adopted useful Anglo-Saxon administrative structures, particularly systems of taxation and land management, that were more sophisticated than Scandinavian models. The economic impact of Viking settlement was transformative. Vikings were not just warriors but skilled craftsmen and traders. They established or revitalized trading centers, with Jorvik becoming one of Europe's largest cities. Archaeological excavations reveal workshops producing metalwork, jewelry, leather goods, and textiles. Trade routes connected Viking England directly to Scandinavia, Ireland, and continental Europe, bypassing traditional Anglo-Saxon commercial networks. The cultural exchange went both directions. Vikings in England gradually adopted Christianity, though the process was slow and uneven. They began minting coins modelled on Anglo-Saxon pennies, but often bearing the names of Viking kings and sometimes Thor's hammer alongside Christian crosses. They adopted Anglo-Saxon architectural styles while introducing their own decorative traditions. The fusion created a distinctive Anglo-Scandinavian culture, visible in art, language, and social customs. Language provides particularly clear evidence of Viking influence. Hundreds of Norse words entered English, including common terms like skill, knife, husband, and law. More significantly, Norse influenced English grammar, contributing to the simplification of Old English into Middle English. The Northern English dialects that emerged from this fusion would significantly influence Standard English, making modern English partly a product of Viking settlement. While Halfdan consolidated Viking control in the north, Guthrum continued campaigning in the south. His force, still formidable despite the division, launched a surprise winter attack on Wessex in 878. Alfred, celebrating Christmas at Chippenham, barely escaped capture. Within weeks, Guthrum controlled most of Wessex. Alfred retreated to the Somerset marshes, establishing a guerrilla base at Athelney, from which he coordinated resistance. The campaign of 878 marked the crucial turning point in Viking conquest of England. Alfred's recovery from near defeat, his rallying of the Wessex Fyrd, and his victory over Guthrum at Edington demonstrated that Viking expansion had reached its limits. The subsequent Treaty of Wedmore formalized the partition of England. Guthrum agreed to convert to Christianity and withdraw to East Anglia, where he ruled as King Athelstan until his death in 890. The treaty established what later became known as the Danelaw, the portion of England under Viking law and control. This included East Anglia, most of Mercia and Northumbria, roughly everything north and east of a line from London to Chester. Within this territory, Viking law and custom prevailed, though local variations were significant. The Danelaw was never a unified political entity, but rather a patchwork of Viking kingdoms, jarldoms, and semi-independent territories. The establishment of the Danelaw represented the transformation of Vikings from raiders to rulers. They had to manage complex agricultural economies, administer justice among diverse populations, and defend their territories from both Anglo-Saxon attempts at reconquest and new Viking raiders. This required different skills from those that had brought them success as raiders. Some Vikings adapted successfully, becoming sophisticated political leaders. Others struggled with the responsibilities of governance. The Viking kingdoms in England developed their own characters. The Kingdom of York became the most significant, controlling much of northern England and maintaining close ties with the Viking Kingdom of Dublin. East Anglia developed a more Anglo-Scandinavian character with extensive intermarriage and cultural fusion. The 5 boroughs of Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, Leicester, and Stamford formed a confederation that balanced local autonomy with collective defence. International connections remained vital to these Viking territories. Warriors and traders moved freely between England, Ireland, and Scandinavia. A Viking lord might hold lands in Yorkshire, have family ties in Dublin, and maintain allegiance to a Norwegian king. This network facilitated trade, military recruitment, and cultural exchange across the Viking world. Silver from Islamic lands reached England through this network, while English wheat fed Scandinavian settlements. The military revolution initiated by the Great Army had lasting consequences. The Vikings demonstrated that mobility, intelligence, and tactical flexibility could overcome numerical disadvantage and defensive positions. They showed that professional warriors, properly organized and supplied, could defeat traditional militia forces. These lessons were not lost on Anglo-Saxon leaders who began adopting Viking military innovations even as they fought against Viking expansion. The religious dimension of Viking conquest proved complex. While many Vikings eventually converted to Christianity, the process was gradual and often superficial. Christian and pagan practices coexisted for generations. Vikings might attend Mass on Sunday and sacrifice to Odin before battle. They produced artifacts combining Christian and pagan symbolism, suggesting syncretic religious beliefs rather than simple conversion. The role of Viking women in the conquest period deserves consideration. While the Great Army was predominantly male, women followed soon after territories were secured. They established households, managed estates, while men were campaigning and maintained Scandinavian domestic culture in foreign lands. Some women held significant political power, particularly widows who inherited their husbands' positions. The Lady of the Mercians, Ethelflaed, though Anglo-Saxon herself, demonstrated that women could exercise military and political leadership in this period. As the 870s drew to a close, the age of conquest was giving way to an age of consolidation. The easy targets had been taken, and remaining Anglo-Saxon territories had strengthened their defences. New Viking arrivals found established Viking rulers as likely to resist them as Anglo-Saxon ones. The political landscape of the British Isles had been permanently altered. Where once there had been numerous Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, now there was a rough balance between Anglo-Saxon Wessex and its dependencies and the various Viking territories of the Danelaw. This transformation from raiders to rulers marked a crucial evolution in Viking society. The skills that made them successful conquerors, violence, opportunism, and mobility, were not always those needed for successful governance. Some Vikings made this transition successfully, establishing dynasties that would rule for generations. Others failed, their territories fragmenting or falling to Anglo-Saxon reconquest. The great age of Viking conquest in England was ending, but the age of Anglo-Scandinavian culture was just beginning. While their western kinsmen carved kingdoms from Anglo-Saxon lands, other Vikings turned their longships toward the rising sun, where vast rivers promised pathways to unimaginable wealth. The eastern route had been known to Scandinavian traders for generations, but in the middle of the 9th century it transformed from a trickle of adventurers into a flood of merchants, warriors, and settlers who would reshape the destiny of Eastern Europe and establish trading networks stretching from the Baltic to Baghdad. The geography of Eastern Europe seemed designed by the gods specifically for Viking expansion. Unlike the treacherous Atlantic crossings required to reach Iceland or the contested channels leading to England, the eastern route offered a network of navigable rivers that served as highways into the continental interior. From the Baltic Sea, Vikings could enter the Daugava, the Neva, the Volkhov, and dozens of smaller waterways. These rivers led south toward the Black Sea and the Caspian, toward the wealthy empires of Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate. The Scandinavians who took this eastern route were primarily Swedes, though Danes and Norwegians joined their expeditions. The Slavic peoples they encountered called them Rus, possibly derived from the Finnish word for Sweden, Rutsi, which itself may have originated from the Swedish coastal region of Roslagen. These Rus Vikings would give their name to Russia, though they began as foreign conquerors and traders rather than native rulers. The first stages of Rus expansion involved establishing control over key portage points and trading posts along the river routes. The town of Staraya Ladoga, founded in the 750s at the point where the Volkhov River approaches Lake Ladoga, became the first major Rus center. Archaeological evidence reveals a sophisticated settlement, with workshops producing glass beads, bronze ornaments, and iron tools. The mixture of Scandinavian, Slavic, Finnish, and Baltic artifacts suggests a cosmopolitan trading community from its earliest days. From Ladoga, the Rus pushed south along the Volkhov toward Lake Ilmen, where they encountered the Slavic settlement that would become Novgorod. The Russian primary chronicle, written centuries later but preserving oral traditions, tells of conflict between various Slavic and Finnish tribes in the region. Unable to govern themselves peacefully, these tribes supposedly invited the Rus prince Rurik and his brothers to rule over them in 862. "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us," the invitation allegedly read. Whether this invitation was genuine or a later justification for conquest matters less than what followed. Rurik established himself at Novgorod, creating the first stable Rus principality. His successors would push further south, following the Dnieper River toward the Black Sea. This expansion was not merely military conquest, but the creation of a sophisticated commercial network that would channel goods between Scandinavia and the Mediterranean world. The Dnieper route was treacherous, punctuated by rapids that required boats to be portaged, sometimes for miles. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, writing in the 10th century, described 7 major rapids providing both their Slavic and Scandinavian names. At these portage points, traders were vulnerable to attack by steppe nomads, particularly the Pechenegs, who controlled much of the Ukrainian steppe. The Rus developed elaborate security procedures, with warriors protecting the merchants, while boats and goods were hauled overland. The journey from Scandinavia to Constantinople took months. Traders would leave Sweden in early summer, reaching the Russian river system as it became navigable after the spring floods. They spent the summer moving south, trading with local populations along the way. They wintered at major centers like Novgorod, Kiev, or Smolensk, using the frozen months to repair equipment, build new boats, and engage in local trade. The following spring they continued their journey, reaching Constantinople or the Caspian ports by late summer. The establishment of Kiev as the principal Rus center occurred around 882 when Oleg, Rurik's successor, captured the city from other Varangian adventurers. Kiev's location was strategic, controlling the Dnieper route while being far enough south to engage directly with the steppe nomads who controlled access to Byzantine and Islamic markets. Under Oleg and his successors, Kiev became what historians would later call the mother of Russian cities, the center of a loose confederation of Rus principalities stretching from Ladoga to the Black Sea. The Rus relationship with Byzantium was complex, alternating between trade, diplomacy, and warfare. The Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome's eastern territories, was the wealthiest and most sophisticated state in Europe. Constantinople, with its population approaching 500,000, dwarfed any city in Western Europe. Its markets offered silk, spices, wine, jewelry, and manufactured goods of unparalleled quality. For Byzantine merchants, the Rus brought products from the northern forests: furs, honey, wax, amber, and slaves. The slave trade formed a dark cornerstone of Rus commerce. Slavic captives, from whom the word slave derives, were particularly valued in Byzantine and Islamic markets. The Rus raided Slavic settlements or purchased captives from ongoing local conflicts. These slaves were transported south in chains, the young women destined for harems or domestic service, the men for agricultural labor or military service. The profits from this human trafficking funded much of the Rus expansion and enrichment. In 907, Oleg led a massive expedition against Constantinople itself, supposedly involving 2,000 ships. While this number is certainly exaggerated, the expedition was substantial enough to force the Byzantines to negotiate. The resulting treaty, preserved in the Russian Primary Chronicle, established formal trading relations. The Rus received tribute, trading privileges, and the right to maintain a compound in Constantinople where their merchants could stay. In return, they agreed to limit their armed presence and respect Byzantine law while in imperial territory. The treaty provisions reveal the sophistication of Rus-Byzantine relations. Rus merchants could remain in Constantinople for 6 months, receiving provisions from the imperial government. They could use the baths free of charge, a significant privilege in a city where public bathing was a central social activity. They had to register with imperial officials and carry seals proving their legitimate trader status. These arrangements suggest regular, large-scale commerce rather than sporadic raiding. Subsequent treaties in 911 and 944 expanded and refined these arrangements. The Rus gained the right to serve as mercenaries in Byzantine armies, beginning the tradition of the Varangian Guard. This elite unit, composed primarily of Scandinavians who reached Constantinople via the Russian rivers, became the Byzantine Emperor's personal bodyguard. Service in the Varangian Guard offered enormous prestige and wealth, attracting warriors from across the Viking world. Harald Hardrada, future king of Norway, would serve with distinction in the Guard during the 1030s and 1040s. The cultural impact of Byzantine contact on the Rus was profound. Byzantine artists and architects traveled north, bringing techniques for stone construction and fresco painting. The Rus elite adopted Byzantine court ceremonial dress and administrative practices. Most significantly, Byzantine Christianity began penetrating Rus society. While the official conversion would not occur until 988 under Vladimir the Great, Christian influences appeared much earlier. Princess Olga of Kiev converted in 945, and churches existed in Kiev for the Christian minority among merchants and mercenaries. Yet Byzantium was not the only southern market for Rus traders. The Volga route led to the Caspian Sea and the immensely wealthy Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, controlled territories from Central Asia to North Africa. Its cities were centers of learning, craft production, and commerce that surpassed anything in contemporary Europe. The hunger for northern products, particularly furs and slaves, in these Islamic markets created enormous opportunities for Rus merchants. The Volga route was controlled by the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people who had established a powerful state at the confluence of the Volga and Kama rivers. The Bulgars served as intermediaries between the Rus and Islamic merchants, taking substantial profits from this position. The Rus alternated between cooperation and conflict with the Bulgars, sometimes trying to bypass them by taking alternate routes or launching military expeditions to force better terms. The Arabic writer Ibn Fadlan encountered Rus traders on the Volga in 921, leaving the most detailed contemporary account of their appearance and customs. He described them as the filthiest of God's creatures, but also as perfect physical specimens, tall as palm trees with red hair and elaborate tattoos. He witnessed their trading practices, religious rituals, and most famously, the ship burial of a Rus chieftain, complete with human sacrifice. His account, while filtered through Islamic cultural prejudices, provides invaluable insights into Rus society. The wealth flowing from Islamic lands transformed Scandinavian society. Hundreds of thousands of Islamic silver dirhams have been found in Scandinavian hoards, far exceeding the amount of Western European coinage from the same period. This silver funded the construction of ships, the purchase of weapons, and the hiring of warriors for Western raids. The Eastern trade effectively subsidized Viking expansion in Western Europe, creating a complex economic system spanning the known world. The Rus traders developed sophisticated financial instruments to manage long-distance commerce. They used standardized weights for measuring silver, often cutting coins into fragments to achieve precise values. They developed credit systems allowing traders to deposit wealth in one city and withdraw it in another. They created partnerships where investors would fund expeditions in exchange for shares of profits, spreading risk and allowing larger ventures than any individual could finance. The cultural exchange along these eastern routes was not unidirectional. Scandinavian artistic styles influenced Slavic and steppe nomad metalwork. Norse mythology and saga traditions blended with Slavic folklore. The druzhina, the military retinue of Rus princes, combined Scandinavian warrior culture with steppe cavalry tactics. This cultural fusion created something unique, neither purely Scandinavian nor purely Slavic, but distinctly Rus. The archaeological evidence from Rus settlements reveals this cultural mixing. Graves contain Scandinavian-style weapons alongside steppe nomad horse equipment and Byzantine jewelry. Buildings combined Scandinavian construction techniques with Slavic decorative elements. Even diet changed, with Rus settlers adopting local agricultural products while maintaining some Scandinavian food preferences, particularly for fish and game. Women played significant roles in the eastern expansion, though their contributions are often overlooked. They managed trading households during men's long absences, supervised craft production, and maintained commercial networks. Some women became successful traders in their own right. Princess Olga ruled Kiev as regent for nearly 2 decades, conducting diplomacy with Byzantium and maintaining the Rus commercial network. The respect accorded to her by Byzantine emperors suggests that women could exercise real power in Rus society. The religious diversity of the eastern routes created unique challenges and opportunities. The Rus encountered Christianity in Byzantine, Islamic monotheism along the Volga, Judaism among the Khazars who controlled the lower Volga before their decline, and various forms of paganism among Slavic and Finnish peoples. This religious marketplace forced the Rus to be pragmatic about faith. Many maintained their Norse paganism while showing respect for other religions when commercially advantageous. The military techniques developed by the Rus combined Viking infantry tactics with adaptations necessary for steppe warfare. They learned to fight mounted nomads, developing combined arms tactics using infantry shield walls supported by mounted archers recruited from allied steppe peoples. They became expert at river warfare, creating fleets of smaller, more maneuverable vessels suited to river navigation while maintaining the Viking tradition of coordinated naval assault. The Rus also became sophisticated fortress builders, combining Scandinavian, Slavic, and Byzantine techniques. Their strongholds, called grods, controlled river crossings and portage points. These fortifications served as administrative centers, trading posts, and military bases. The largest, like Kiev and Novgorod, grew into genuine cities with permanent populations engaged in craft production, administration, and commerce, rather than just seasonal trading. The administration of Rus territories required adapting Scandinavian customs to new circumstances. The thing assemblies that governed Scandinavian communities were impractical for ruling diverse populations across vast distances. Instead, the Rus developed a system where princes controlled cities and their surrounding territories, extracting tribute from subject populations while providing protection and justice. This system, influenced by Byzantine and steppe models, would evolve into the distinctive political structure of medieval Russia. By the mid-10th century, the Rus had created the largest political entity in Europe, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Their river networks connected Scandinavia to Byzantium and the Islamic world, facilitating not just trade, but the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures. The silver flowing north through these routes funded further Viking expansion, while the goods flowing south enriched Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilizations. The success of the Eastern Vikings demonstrated the adaptability of Scandinavian culture. While their Western cousins were becoming Frankish nobles or English lords, the Eastern Vikings became Rus princes, Byzantine guardsmen, and Volga traders. They showed that Viking expansion was not simply about raiding and conquest, but about recognizing and exploiting commercial opportunities wherever they appeared. The legacy of the Rus Vikings would long outlast their distinctly Scandinavian character. As they intermarried with Slavic populations and adopted Orthodox Christianity, they gradually lost their Norse identity. Yet the states they founded, the trade routes they established, and the cultural connections they created would shape Eastern European history for centuries. The Rurikid dynasty, allegedly descended from the legendary Rurik, would rule various Russian principalities until the 17th century. The Eastern expansion also demonstrated the interconnectedness of the medieval world. A piece of Islamic silver minted in Baghdad might travel through Khazar territories, be traded by Rus merchants in Kiev, transported to Novgorod, and eventually buried in a Swedish hoard. A Byzantine silk purchased in Constantinople might clothe a Norwegian queen. A Frankish sword might arm a Rus warrior fighting Pechenegs on the Ukrainian steppe. The Vikings were not isolated raiders, but participants in a global economy that stretched from Greenland to Central Asia. As the 10th century progressed, the eastern routes began to change. The Pechenegs increasingly disrupted the Dnieper route, making travel to Constantinople more dangerous. The Volga Bulgars converted to Islam, altering their relationship with the Rus. New powers emerged on the steppe, forcing the Rus to adapt their strategies. Yet the foundations laid during this century of expansion would endure. The Rus had proven that Vikings could be more than raiders and conquerors. They could be state builders and commercial innovators who reshaped entire regions through trade as much as through war. The transformation of Swedish Vikings into Rus princes, of raiders into merchants, of pagans into Christians and Muslims demonstrated the remarkable flexibility of Viking culture. They succeeded not by imposing a rigid Scandinavian model on conquered territories, but by adapting to local conditions while maintaining their military and commercial advantages. This ability to transform while retaining core cultural elements would be the key to Viking success wherever they ventured, from the frozen shores of Iceland to the sun-baked markets of Baghdad. The waters beyond Norway's western shore had always whispered of mysteries to those who dared to listen. Fishermen spoke of islands that appeared and vanished in the mist, of whales that followed currents to unknown feeding grounds, of birds that flew with purpose toward horizons where no land should exist. In the latter decades of the 9th century, as Viking settlements grew crowded and political tensions mounted in Norway, these whispers became irresistible calls to adventure for those seeking new beginnings, far from the reach of ambitious kings. The North Atlantic, that vast expanse of storm-tossed water between Norway and the unknown West, had long been considered the edge of the world. Irish monks, those zealous seekers of isolation for their prayers, had ventured into these waters in their leather boats, finding scattered islands where they could commune with their God undisturbed. They called this practice peregrinatio, voluntary exile for the sake of spiritual purification. Some reached the Faroe Islands, others may have travelled even further, leaving behind only hints of their presence in place names and half-remembered stories. The Faroe Islands, lying roughly halfway between Norway and Iceland, became the first stepping stone for Scandinavian expansion into the Atlantic. Norse settlers arrived in the early 9th century, finding islands that offered good grazing land for sheep, sheltered harbours for ships, and isolation from the increasingly violent politics of mainland Scandinavia. These early colonists established patterns that would be repeated on a grander scale in Iceland. They brought their livestock, their legal traditions, and their social structures, recreating Scandinavian society in miniature on these remote islands. The settlement of the Faroes was relatively peaceful, with the Norse either displacing or absorbing the few Irish hermits they encountered. The islands offered limited agricultural potential but excellent pastoral land. Sheep thrived in the cool, damp climate, providing wool, meat, and milk. The surrounding seas teemed with fish, whales, and seabirds. While never wealthy, the Faroes settlers achieved self-sufficiency and maintained their independence from Norwegian control for generations. Yet it was Iceland that would capture the Viking imagination and become the greatest achievement of Norse colonization. The island had been known to Norse sailors for decades before permanent settlement began. They called it variously the Land of Ice, Snowland, or Gardasholm, after an early explorer. The Irish monks who had preceded them called it Thule, the ultimate land at the world's edge. These monks, seeking perfect isolation for their devotions, fled when the Norse arrived, unwilling to share their sanctuary with pagans. The traditional date for the beginning of Iceland's permanent settlement is 874, when Ingolf Arnason established his farm at what would become Reykjavik. Yet Ingolf was not acting alone or spontaneously. The settlement of Iceland was an organized endeavor driven by specific political and social pressures in Norway. The rise of Harald Fairhair, who sought to unite all of Norway under his rule, created a crisis for local chieftains accustomed to independence. Rather than submit to Harald's authority or die resisting it, many chose exile. Harald Fairhair's campaign to unify Norway represented a fundamental transformation in Scandinavian political organization. Norway had always been a land of fjords and valleys, each naturally isolated from its neighbors, each dominated by local strongmen who acknowledged no superior authority. Harald, beginning from his power base in Vestfold, systematically conquered or co-opted these local rulers. His victory at the Battle of Hafrsfjord, traditionally dated to 872 but possibly later, marked the symbolic unification of Norway under a single crown. The methods Harald employed to maintain control revolutionized Norwegian governance. He imposed taxes on all land, claiming ultimate ownership of Norwegian soil. He appointed jarls to govern regions in his name, replacing the traditional hereditary local rulers. He demanded military service from all free men, creating a national army rather than relying on personal retinues. These innovations, while strengthening royal power, alienated many who saw them as violations of ancient freedoms. The exodus to Iceland included some of Norway's most prominent families. These were not desperate refugees, but wealthy landowners who could afford to transport their households, livestock, and followers across the North Atlantic. They brought ships filled with cattle, horses, sheep, pigs, and poultry. They carried seeds for crops, tools for building and farming, and weapons for defense. Most importantly, they brought their concepts of law, governance, and social organization. The journey to Iceland required exceptional seamanship and favorable conditions. The voyage from Norway typically took between 3 days and a week, depending on weather and the skill of the navigator. Ships followed a route that took them past the Shetland Islands and the Faroes, using these landmarks for navigation. In clear weather, it was possible to see from one landmark to the next, following an island chain to Iceland. In poor visibility, navigators relied on observations of wave patterns, bird behavior, and perhaps the legendary sunstone that could reveal the sun's position through clouds. Iceland offered both challenges and opportunities to settlers. The island was larger than Ireland, with vast, uninhabited spaces available for claiming. The coastal areas provided good grazing land, while the interior remained largely inhospitable, dominated by glaciers, volcanoes, and lava fields. There were no indigenous peoples to displace or conquer, no existing political structures to navigate or overthrow. This was truly virgin territory where Norse society could develop free from external influences. The process of land-taking followed established patterns modified for local conditions. The first arrivals claimed vast territories, far more than they could effectively use. Ingolf Arnason reportedly claimed all the land within a day's walk from his initial settlement. Later arrivals had to negotiate with established settlers, either purchasing land or accepting it as gifts that created obligations of loyalty and support. Within 2 generations, all usable land in Iceland had been claimed. The Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, compiled centuries later, preserves traditions about this colonization period. It names over 400 principal settlers and describes their land claims, genealogies, and notable deeds. While certainly containing legendary elements, this text provides invaluable insights into the settlement process and the society that emerged. It reveals a colonization that was remarkably orderly, with disputes settled through negotiation or formal legal procedures rather than violence. The absence of a king in Iceland was not accidental, but deliberate. The settlers had fled royal authority in Norway and had no intention of recreating it in their new home. Instead, they developed a unique form of governance based on assemblies called things. These gatherings, which had existed in various forms throughout Scandinavia, became the primary political institutions of Iceland. Local things settled disputes and made decisions affecting their districts. Regional things coordinated between districts. The establishment of the Althing in 930 marked Iceland's emergence as a unified political entity, though one without a central executive authority. The Althing met annually at Thingvellir, a dramatic site where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates meet, creating a natural amphitheatre. All free men could attend, though only chieftains, called godhar, had formal voting rights. The Althing served as legislature, high court, and social gathering, the heartbeat of Icelandic society. The office of the law speaker embodied Iceland's unique approach to governance. This individual, elected for a 3-year term, was required to memorize and recite the entire law code, 1/3 each year at the Althing. In a society where literacy remained limited, the law speaker served as a living repository of legal knowledge. The position carried great prestige but little executive power, reflecting Iceland's suspicion of concentrated authority. Icelandic law was remarkably sophisticated, addressing everything from property rights to personal injury, with detailed provisions and established penalties. The principle of compensation rather than retribution dominated legal thinking. Every injury had a price, from minor insults to murder. These compensations were negotiated through formal procedures, with standardized values providing starting points for negotiations. The goal was to restore social harmony rather than exact vengeance, though the system did not always prevent feuds. The Thing system extended beyond Iceland, developing throughout the Scandinavian world during this period. In Norway, despite Harald Hardrada's centralizing efforts, local and regional things retained significant authority. They served as checks on royal power, forums where free men could voice opposition to royal policies. The tension between royal authority and Thing democracy would characterize Norwegian politics for centuries. In Denmark, the evolution towards centralized monarchy proceeded differently. The Danish kingdom had deeper roots than Norwegian unification, with the Jelling dynasty claiming authority back to the legendary Gorm the Old. Yet Denmark, too, had its things, and Danish kings had to balance their authority with the traditional rights of free men to participate in governance. The Danish things would eventually evolve into formal councils that advised and sometimes constrained royal power. Sweden remained the most fragmented of the Scandinavian kingdoms during this period. Regional power centers in Uppland, Gotland, and other provinces maintained significant autonomy. The Swedish kings, based in Uppsala, exercised limited authority beyond their core territories. Swedish things retained more power than their Norwegian or Danish counterparts, with the right to elect and even depose kings. This decentralized structure would persist longer in Sweden than in the other Scandinavian kingdoms. The development of Scandinavian law during this period reveals sophisticated legal thinking. The concept of weregild, compensation for injury or death, created elaborate scales of value based on social status, gender, and circumstances. The laws addressed property rights with provisions for inheritance, sale, and dispute resolution that would not seem out of place in modern legal systems. Contract law was particularly well developed, necessary for managing the complex trading relationships that characterized Viking commerce. Women's legal status in Viking Age Scandinavia was complex and in some ways more advantageous than in contemporary European societies. Women could own property, request divorces, and serve as witnesses in legal proceedings. They managed households that might include dozens of people and controlled the keys that symbolized domestic authority. While excluded from things and formal political power, women exercised significant informal influence through their control of domestic economies and their roles as peace weavers between feuding families. The institution of marriage reflected both women's agency and their commodification in Viking society. Marriages were negotiated contracts between families, with bride prices and dowries carefully specified. Yet women retained control over their dowries and could initiate divorce for various causes including abuse, neglect, or a husband's failure to provide. Divorced women retained their property and could remarry freely. This system, while far from modern equality, provided women with more protections and options than existed in most contemporary societies. The colonization of the North Atlantic islands created new challenges for traditional Scandinavian social structures. In Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, society was anchored in ancient patterns of land ownership and family connections stretching back generations. In Iceland and the Faroes, these patterns had to be recreated from scratch. New aristocracies emerged based on the initial land claims, but social mobility remained greater than in the homeland. A successful farmer or trader could rise to prominence within a generation, impossible in the more rigid hierarchies of mainland Scandinavia. The economic basis of these Atlantic colonies differed significantly from mainland Scandinavia. Iceland had no native timber suitable for shipbuilding, forcing reliance on imported wood or driftwood from Siberia that occasionally washed ashore. The island's volcanic soil was fertile but vulnerable to erosion once the thin forest cover was removed. The short growing season limited agricultural options to hardy crops like barley and root vegetables. Animal husbandry, particularly sheep raising, became the economic foundation. Trade networks quickly developed to supply what the Atlantic colonies could not produce themselves. Ships from Norway brought timber, grain, and manufactured goods, returning with wool, fish, and exotic goods like walrus ivory and falcon feathers. These trade relationships created dependencies that would eventually allow Norwegian kings to assert authority over the theoretically independent Atlantic colonies. Economic leverage proved more effective than military force in extending royal power across the North Atlantic. The intellectual culture that developed in Iceland would preserve and transform Scandinavian traditions for posterity. The combination of isolation, literacy, and political independence created ideal conditions for cultural preservation and innovation. Icelandic skalds, or court poets, maintained the complex poetic traditions of the Viking age long after they had declined elsewhere. The sagas that would be written down in medieval Iceland preserved not just stories, but entire worldviews from the Viking age. The settlement patterns established during this period would endure for centuries. The farmsteads scattered across Iceland's habitable coast, the things that governed local affairs, the networks of kinship and obligation that structured society, all persisted with remarkable continuity. Archaeological excavations reveal farmhouses occupied continuously for hundreds of years, with only gradual modifications to accommodate changing needs and technologies. Religious practices in the Atlantic colonies evolved differently from those in mainland Scandinavia. Isolated from Christian influences that increasingly penetrated Norway and Denmark, Icelandic paganism maintained its vitality longer. The Godhar who led local things were also pagan priests, maintaining temples and conducting sacrifices. This connection between religious and political authority would complicate Iceland's eventual conversion to Christianity. The Atlantic colonies also served as laboratories for legal and social experimentation. Without kings to impose uniformity, different regions developed variations in law and custom. The pharaohs developed their own legal code, the Sædabravid, adapted from Norwegian law but modified for local conditions. Iceland's Gragas law code, while not written down until the 12th century, preserves legal traditions that evolved during the settlement period. The success of North Atlantic colonization encouraged further exploration. Iceland became a base for voyages even further west, to Greenland and eventually to North America. The same motivations that drove settlers to Iceland, political freedom, economic opportunity, and adventure, would push their descendants to seek new lands beyond the western horizon. The skills developed in colonizing Iceland, organizing expeditions, establishing settlements, adapting to harsh environments, would be applied to even more challenging ventures. As the 10th century progressed, the Atlantic colonies faced new challenges. The initial period of easy land-taking was over. Population growth strained resources, particularly in Iceland where erosion was reducing usable farmland. Political conflicts, initially rare, became more common as competition for resources intensified. The absence of central authority, initially seen as liberation from tyranny, sometimes left communities unable to resolve disputes peacefully. The evolution of powerful families who dominated local things began to recreate the aristocratic hierarchies the original settlers had fled. These gaudy families controlled religious sites, accumulated vast landholdings, and commanded the loyalty of numerous followers. While Iceland remained technically a commonwealth of equals, practical power increasingly concentrated in fewer hands. This concentration would eventually lead to the violent conflicts of the Sturlung Age and Iceland's loss of independence. Yet, for a brief historical moment, perhaps 2 centuries, the North Atlantic colonies represented something unique in medieval Europe. They were societies without kings, where law emerged from community consensus rather than royal decree. They demonstrated that sophisticated civilization could exist without centralized authority, that order could emerge from negotiation rather than coercion. While this experiment would ultimately fail, overwhelmed by internal contradictions and external pressures, it left a legacy of legal and political thinking that would influence Scandinavian and indeed European development for centuries to come. The man who would open the final chapter of Viking westward expansion was marked by violence from his earliest days. Erik Thorvaldsson, known to history as Erik the Red, inherited not just his father's red hair and fiery temperament, but also his status as an outlaw. Thorvald had been exiled from Norway for murder, seeking refuge in Iceland, where land was becoming scarce and conflicts over resources increasingly common. Erik grew to manhood in this environment of tension and competition, learning that violence could solve problems but also create new ones. Iceland in the late 10th century was no longer the land of unlimited opportunity that had attracted Erik's grandfather's generation. All productive land had been claimed, divided, and subdivided among the descendants of the original settlers. Young men seeking to establish themselves had few options beyond serving established chieftains, marrying into landed families, or taking what they wanted by force. Erik chose violence, engaging in feuds that resulted in multiple killings and ultimately his outlawry from Iceland for 3 years. For most men, banishment from Iceland meant death or a humiliating return to Norway as a failure. Erik chose neither. Stories had circulated for decades about a land to the west, glimpsed by storm-driven sailors blown off course. Gunnbjorn Ulfsson had reported seeing skerries and a coastline beyond them, somewhere past the setting sun. These Gunnbjorn skerries had become part of Icelandic maritime law, a mystery that promised either opportunity or death for whoever dared to investigate. Erik departed Iceland in 982 with a single ship, his household, and followers who preferred the uncertainty of exploration to the certainty of poverty in Iceland. The voyage west from Iceland's Snæfellsnes Peninsula required crossing nearly 500 miles of open ocean, navigating through waters where icebergs drifted like floating mountains, and fog could obscure all landmarks for days. The psychological challenge matched the physical one. Every mile west took them further from known waters, further from any possibility of rescue if disaster struck. The first sight of Greenland's eastern coast would have been forbidding even to experienced Norse sailors. Massive glaciers carved directly into the sea, creating a maze of icebergs that could crush a ship like an egg. The coast seemed an impenetrable wall of ice and rock, justifying every sailor's fear about the edge of the world. Yet Erik was committed by necessity and temperament to continue. He turned south, following the coast until it bent west, then north into more hospitable waters. What Erik found as he explored Greenland's southwestern coast exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Deep fjords penetrated the coastal mountains, protecting inner reaches from the worst Arctic weather. These fjords contained meadows where grass grew thick enough to support cattle, slopes covered with dwarf willows and birches that could provide fuel and building material, and waters teeming with seals, walrus, and fish. The land was uninhabited, though ruins of ancient dwellings showed that people had lived there before. Erik spent his 3 years of exile systematically exploring this new land, sailing deep into fjords, climbing mountains to survey the interior, and carefully noting resources and potential settlement sites. He named prominent features with the optimism of a real estate developer. The fjord where he established his base became Erik's Fjord. The grassy slopes became green fields. When his exile ended and he returned to Iceland in 985, he called the entire land Greenland, a name chosen deliberately to attract settlers. The recruitment speech Erik delivered in Iceland was a masterpiece of persuasion mixed with genuine opportunity. He spoke of fjords larger than any in Iceland, of untouched grazing lands, of walrus and narwhal whose ivory was worth its weight in silver. He minimized the challenges of distance and climate while emphasizing the chance to claim vast estates impossible to obtain in Iceland. To men frustrated by Iceland's limited opportunities, Erik's words were irresistible. The colonization fleet that departed Iceland in 986 represented one of the most ambitious Viking expeditions ever attempted. 25 ships carried perhaps 700 people along with their livestock, tools and supplies for establishing a new society. These were not raiders seeking quick plunder, but families committing to permanent settlement in an unknown land. The ships were loaded beyond normal capacity, their hulls sitting low in the water, making them vulnerable to the storms that plagued the North Atlantic. The voyage became a disaster that nearly ended Greenland colonization before it began. Storms scattered the fleet almost immediately. Some ships were driven back to Iceland, their crews and passengers too traumatized to attempt the crossing again. Others vanished into the grey waters, leaving no trace of their fate. Only 14 ships reached Greenland, carrying perhaps 400 survivors. This 40% casualty rate would have ended most colonization attempts, but the survivors had nowhere else to go. The establishment of the Greenland colony proceeded with remarkable efficiency despite the traumatic voyage. Eric had already identified the best settlement sites during his exploration, allowing the colonists to quickly claim land and begin construction. The eastern settlement, centered on Eric's fjord, became the primary colony. The western settlement, actually located northwest of the eastern settlement, was established simultaneously. Together, these settlements would eventually support perhaps 5,000 people at their peak. The Norse Greenlanders developed a society uniquely adapted to their harsh environment. They raised cattle and sheep in the inner fjords where microclimates allowed adequate grazing. They hunted seals for meat and blubber, walrus for ivory, and caribou for meat and hides. They collected eiderdown from nesting sites, gathered berries during the brief summer, and learned to preserve food for the long winter months when darkness lasted 20 hours a day. Architecture in Greenland evolved to meet environmental challenges unknown in Iceland or Norway. Buildings were constructed with thick turf walls, providing insulation against temperatures that could drop to -40 degrees. Stone foundations prevented moisture damage from permafrost. Central halls were designed to conserve heat from small fires, as wood was too precious to burn liberally. Every structure represented a careful balance between Norse tradition and Arctic necessity. The Greenland colony's economy depended entirely on trade with Europe. The island produced nothing that its inhabitants could not obtain more easily elsewhere, except luxury goods for European markets. Walrus ivory became Greenland's primary export, competing with elephant ivory in European markets. Polar bear pelts, considered suitable gifts for kings and bishops, commanded extraordinary prices. Gefalcons, the white hunting birds prized by medieval nobility, were captured and transported alive to European courts. The voyage from Greenland to Norway required exceptional planning and seamanship. Ships departed Greenland in late summer, carrying a year's accumulation of trade goods. They sailed to Iceland, then to Norway, trading at each stop. The return voyage brought iron, timber, grain, and manufactured goods that Greenland could not produce. A successful trading voyage could make a captain wealthy. A failed voyage, whether from shipwreck, pirates, or market fluctuations, could doom entire Greenland communities dependent on imported goods. It was from Greenland that the Norse would make their final leap westward to the shores of North America. The discovery occurred around 985, when Bjarni Herjolfsson, sailing from Iceland to Greenland, was blown off course by storms. He sighted land to the west, but, focused on reaching Greenland before winter, did not investigate. His report of forested coastlines sparked intense interest in timber-starved Greenland, where every piece of usable wood was precious. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, organized the first deliberate expedition to these western lands around the year 1000. His voyage reversed Bjarni's accidental route, sailing west from Greenland with a crew of 35 men. The sagas describe 3 distinct lands discovered on this voyage. Helluland, the land of flat stones, was likely Baffin Island. Markland, the land of forests, was probably Labrador. Vinland, the land of wine, remains debated but was somewhere along the North American coast where wild grapes grew. The name Vinland itself reveals Norse priorities and perceptions. Wine was a luxury good in Scandinavia, imported at great expense from southern Europe. The possibility of producing wine in Norse territories would have seemed miraculous, a sign that they had found a land blessed by the gods. Whether the Vikings actually found grapes or misidentified other berries remains uncertain, but the name's optimism reflects their hopes for this new land. Leif established a base camp in Vinland, constructing buildings that would shelter future expeditions. The exact location of Leif's Budir, Leif's houses, remained a mystery until 1960, when Norwegian archaeologists discovered Norse ruins at Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland. These remains, the only confirmed Norse site in North America, reveal substantial buildings capable of housing perhaps 100 people, along with evidence of ironworking and boat repair. The Norse encountered indigenous peoples in North America, whom they called Skraelings, a derogatory term meaning wretches or weaklings. These were likely ancestors of the Inuit in the north and various First Nations peoples further south. Initial encounters involved cautious trade, with natives offering furs in exchange for Norse cloth and metal goods. The cultural gulf between the groups was vast, with neither understanding the other's language, customs, or intentions. The relationship between Norse and indigenous peoples quickly deteriorated into violence. The sagas describe battles where Norse iron weapons and armor provided advantages, but indigenous numbers and knowledge of the terrain proved decisive. The Norse found themselves in a hostile land where every forest might hide enemies, where they could never relax their vigilance. Unlike Iceland or even Greenland, North America was thoroughly inhabited by peoples unwilling to tolerate Norse colonization. Subsequent expeditions to Vinland met similar fates. Thorfinn Karlsefni led a colonization attempt with 3 ships and perhaps 160 settlers, including women and livestock. They stayed in Vinland for 3 years, long enough for Gudrid Thorbjarnarsdottir to give birth to Snorri, the first European child born in the Americas. Yet constant conflict with indigenous peoples made the colony untenable. The Norse withdrew, acknowledging that however rich Vinland might be, it was beyond their ability to hold. The failure in Vinland marked the western limit of Viking expansion. The Norse had reached the edge of their world, constrained not by navigation or courage, but by logistics and demographics. They lacked the population to colonize lands defended by numerous indigenous peoples. They lacked the supply lines to support settlements thousands of miles from their base. They had found the limits of their remarkable expansion that had carried them from Scandinavian fjords to North American forests. Back in Greenland, the colony settled into a pattern of survival that would persist for 4 centuries. The Greenlanders maintained their Norse identity with remarkable tenacity, building churches that replicated Norwegian styles, maintaining laws based on Norwegian codes, and preserving sagas that connected them to their Scandinavian heritage. Yet isolation inevitably transformed them. They developed their own dialect, their own customs, and their own solutions to unique challenges. The relationship between Greenland and the Norwegian crown evolved from independence to dependence. Initially, Greenland operated as a free commonwealth like early Iceland. The colonists governed themselves through things, elected their own leaders, and maintained their own laws. Yet economic dependence on Norwegian trade created political vulnerability. Norwegian merchants gradually monopolized Greenland trade, dictating prices and terms that impoverished the colony. Christianity came to Greenland around 1000 when Leif Erikson brought the new faith from Norway. The conversion was remarkably peaceful, perhaps because Greenlanders recognized the political and economic advantages of sharing Norway's religion. Churches were built in every settlement, eventually including a cathedral at Gardar and an Augustinian monastery and Benedictine nunnery. The Greenland church became wealthy, controlling the best lands and extracting tithes that further strained the colony's limited resources. The integration of Viking territories into European political structures accelerated during this period. What had begun as independent raids and settlements increasingly came under royal control. Norwegian kings claimed authority over Iceland, Greenland, the Faroes, Orkney, and Shetland, creating a North Atlantic empire. Danish kings consolidated control over England's Danelaw. Swedish influence dominated the Baltic. The age of independent Viking adventure was ending, replaced by state-controlled expansion. This transformation reflected broader changes in European society. The feudal system was solidifying, creating hierarchies of obligation that left little room for the freebooting Vikings of earlier generations. The Church was extending its influence, condemning pagan practices and violence against Christians. Military technology was evolving, with castles and heavy cavalry reducing the effectiveness of Viking hit-and-run tactics. The world that had allowed Viking expansion was disappearing. The Vikings themselves were changing. Conversion to Christianity eliminated the religious justification for raiding churches and monasteries. Intermarriage with local populations diluted Scandinavian identity. The accumulation of wealth from centuries of raiding and trading created aristocracies more interested in preserving their gains than seeking new adventures. The grandsons of Vikings who had sailed unknown seas were content to manage estates and attend court. The economic foundations of Viking society were also shifting. The Islamic silver that had flooded into Scandinavia via Russian rivers decreased as political changes disrupted eastern trade routes. Western European kingdoms developed their own merchant marines, reducing dependence on Viking traders. The special advantages that had made Vikings dominant, superior ships, navigation skills, and military tactics, were being adopted by their former victims. Climate change began affecting Viking colonies by the late 10th century. The medieval warm period that had facilitated Viking expansion was ending. Greenland's marginal agriculture became even more precarious as temperatures dropped. Sea ice increased, making navigation more dangerous. The environmental conditions that had allowed Vikings to prosper in the North Atlantic were deteriorating, though the full impact would not be felt for generations. Yet even as the Viking Age waned, its achievements remained remarkable. In barely 2 centuries, Scandinavians had explored and settled lands from Russia to North America. They had established trade networks connecting Baghdad to Dublin, Constantinople to Reykjavik. They had demonstrated that medieval Europeans were capable of oceanic navigation, complex political organization, and cultural adaptation on a scale not seen since the fall of Rome. The Vinland voyages, though ultimately unsuccessful, proved Europeans could reach the Americas 5 centuries before Columbus. The Greenland colony, despite its eventual failure, showed humans could survive in some of Earth's harshest environments through ingenuity and determination. The Icelandic Commonwealth demonstrated that sophisticated society could exist without monarchical authority. These experiments in exploration and governance left legacies that would influence European development long after the last Viking ship sailed into history. As the year 1000 passed, the Viking Age was transforming into something new. The descendants of Vikings were becoming Normans in France, Russians in the East, English in Britain, and Icelanders in the Atlantic. They maintained elements of their Scandinavian heritage while adapting to local conditions and cultures. The Viking Age was ending not in defeat but in transformation, as the adventurers and raiders of the 9th century became the kings and merchants of the 11th. The old gods were dying in the lands of the north, though their death would be neither quick nor quiet. Throughout the 10th century, the hammer of Thor and the cross of Christ existed in uneasy proximity, worn sometimes by the same person, invoked by the same voice in different circumstances. The transformation of Scandinavia from the last pagan stronghold in Europe to a collection of Christian kingdoms was not a simple story of conversion but a complex negotiation between faiths, a gradual shifting of spiritual allegiance that took generations to complete and left permanent marks on both Christianity and Scandinavian culture. The first Christian missionaries had arrived in Scandinavia long before the Viking Age began. The Frankish Empire, viewing the pagan north as both a threat and an opportunity, had sponsored missions to Denmark as early as the 8th century. These early efforts met with limited success. The missionaries found themselves in courts where kings might listen politely to stories of Christ while maintaining their obligations to Odin and Thor. Some kings accepted baptism for political advantage, only to revert to paganism when circumstances changed. The mission of Ansgar to Sweden and Denmark in the 820s and 830s established the first sustained Christian presence in Scandinavia. Ansgar, later canonized as the Apostle of the North, founded churches in Hedeby and Birka, major trading centers where Christian merchants needed places to worship. He navigated the complex politics of Scandinavian courts with remarkable skill, gaining permission to preach while avoiding direct confrontation with pagan practices. His approach established a pattern of gradual penetration rather than confrontational conversion. Trade routes served as channels for Christian influence more effectively than deliberate missionary efforts. Scandinavian merchants trading in Christian lands encountered a faith that dominated the wealthy markets they wished to access. Some accepted baptism to facilitate trade relationships, adopting Christianity as a commercial convenience. These merchant converts brought Christian ideas back to Scandinavia, creating small Christian communities in trading towns long before rulers considered official conversion. The appeal of Christianity to Scandinavian rulers went beyond spiritual considerations. Christian kingdoms in Europe formed a kind of exclusive club, recognizing each other as legitimate while viewing pagan rulers as barbarians. A Christian king could negotiate with the Holy Roman Emperor or the King of England as a peer. A pagan ruler remained outside this system, his ambassadors treated with suspicion, his treaties considered less binding. Christianity offered a pathway to international respectability. Denmark led Scandinavian conversion, positioned as it was closest to Christian Europe and most exposed to its influence. King Harald Bluetooth, who ruled from approximately 958 to 986, claimed credit for making the Danes Christian. His famous Jelling stone, sometimes called Denmark's baptismal certificate, proclaimed that Harald won all of Denmark and Norway for himself and made the Danes Christian. The stone itself embodied the syncretic nature of early Scandinavian Christianity, combining runic inscriptions with Christian imagery in a thoroughly pagan memorial tradition. Harald's conversion was as much political as spiritual. Pressure from the Holy Roman Empire, particularly from Emperor Otto I, made Christianity a matter of political survival. Otto had demonstrated his power by defeating Harald in battle and forcing him to accept baptism. Yet Harald's Christianity was genuine enough that he built churches, supported clergy, and promoted Christian burial practices. He also alienated many of his subjects, particularly those who saw the new faith as a betrayal of ancestral traditions. The resistance to Harald's Christian policies contributed to his downfall. His son, Svein Forkbeard, led a rebellion that drove Harald into exile. Svein's own relationship with Christianity was pragmatic. He maintained Christian alliances when useful, but showed little personal devotion. His successful invasions of England were motivated by politics and plunder rather than religion. Yet even Svein could not reverse Denmark's Christian trajectory. The infrastructure of Christianity, churches, monasteries, bishops, had taken root too deeply to be removed. Norway's conversion followed a different pattern, characterized by violence and coercion that left deep scars in Norwegian memory. Olaf Tryggvason, who ruled from 995 to 1000, approached Christian conversion with the zeal of a crusader. Having spent his youth as a Viking raider and mercenary, Olaf experienced a dramatic conversion, possibly in England or Ireland. He returned to Norway determined to impose his new faith on his subjects by any means necessary. Olaf's methods were brutal even by Viking age standards. He offered pagans a simple choice: baptism or death. Those who refused conversion might be tortured, mutilated, or killed in ways designed to terrorize others into compliance. He destroyed pagan temples, toppled sacred idols, and prohibited traditional sacrifices. His court poets, dependent on his favor, composed verses praising Christ rather than Odin, fundamentally altering the skaldic tradition that had celebrated pagan gods for centuries. The thoroughness of Olaf's campaign reflected his understanding that paganism was not simply a set of beliefs, but an entire social system. Pagan festivals structured the agricultural year. Pagan oaths bound legal agreements. Pagan rituals marked birth, marriage, and death. To truly convert Norway, Olaf had to replace this entire system with Christian alternatives. He imported priests from England and Germany, established churches in every district, and mandated Christian observance of formerly pagan seasonal celebrations. Resistance to Olaf's forced conversion was fierce but fragmented. Local chieftains who derived authority from their roles as pagan priests faced political extinction. Farmers resented the taxes required to support churches and clergy. Warriors questioned a faith that praised meekness and forgiveness rather than strength and vengeance. Yet organized opposition proved difficult. Olaf controlled military force and used it ruthlessly against rebels. Many Norwegians practiced Christianity publicly while maintaining pagan beliefs privately. Olaf's reign ended when he sailed into an ambush at the Battle of Svolder in 1000, overwhelmed by a coalition of his enemies. His death in battle, possibly by his own hand to avoid capture, created a martyrdom narrative that would influence Norwegian Christianity for centuries. The immediate result, however, was a pagan reaction. The Jarls who succeeded Olaf allowed both faiths to coexist, recognizing that forced conversion had created dangerous instability. The final Christianization of Norway came under Olaf the Sailed Haraldsson, canonized as Saint Olaf, who ruled from 1015 to 1028. Unlike his predecessor, this Olaf employed subtler methods alongside coercion. He built alliances with powerful families, offering them positions in the new Christian hierarchy. He established a Norwegian church organization independent of Danish or German control, appealing to Norwegian pride. Most significantly, he presented Christianity as compatible with Norwegian law and tradition, rather than their replacement. The legal integration of Christianity into Scandinavian society required careful negotiation. Christian law, derived from Roman and biblical sources, conflicted with Germanic legal traditions on fundamental issues. Christianity prohibited blood vengeance, the foundation of traditional justice. It condemned infanticide, sometimes practiced when families could not support additional children. It required monogamous marriage, challenging the polygamous practices of the elite. Reconciling these differences required creative interpretation and gradual implementation. The Thing assemblies became arenas for negotiating religious change. In Iceland, the Althing decided in 1000 to adopt Christianity as the official religion while permitting private pagan practice. This compromise, reached to prevent civil war, demonstrated the pragmatic approach many Scandinavians took toward conversion. The law speaker Thorgeir Thorkelson, himself a pagan priest, made the decision after contemplating for a day and night under a fur cloak. His judgment that Iceland must have one law and one faith to remain united prioritized social cohesion over religious purity. Sweden's conversion proceeded most slowly, with paganism persisting into the 12th century. The Uppsala temple, described by Adam of Bremen in the 1070s, still conducted elaborate pagan sacrifices decades after Norway and Denmark had officially converted. Swedish kings alternated between Christian and pagan depending on political circumstances. The Thing assemblies retained power to reject Christian kings who pushed conversion too aggressively. This resistance reflected Sweden's political decentralization and the strength of traditional institutions. The physical transformation of the Scandinavian landscape marked Christianity's advance. Churches rose where pagan temples had stood, often incorporating materials from the destroyed structures. The distinctive stave churches of Norway, with their dragon head decorations and serpentine carvings, showed how pagan artistic traditions survived in Christian contexts. These buildings were thoroughly Christian in function, but unmistakably Scandinavian in form, creating a unique architectural tradition. The first churches were simple wooden structures, often no larger than traditional halls. As Christianity established itself, more ambitious buildings arose. Cathedral churches in emerging towns required new construction techniques. Stone construction, rare in Scandinavia outside fortifications, became necessary for prestigious churches. Master builders from England and Germany brought Romanesque architectural styles, training local craftsmen who adapted these foreign forms to local materials and conditions. Monasteries introduced new economic and social institutions to Scandinavia. These communities, following Benedictine or Augustinian rules, created centers of literacy and learning in a largely oral culture. Monks cleared forests, drained marshes, and introduced agricultural innovations. They maintained scriptoriums where sagas were first written down, preserving pagan literature, even as they promoted Christian doctrine. The tension between preserving and condemning pagan culture would characterize Scandinavian monasticism throughout the medieval period. The economic impact of conversion was substantial. Churches required funding through tithes, a tax unknown in pagan Scandinavia. The church claimed 1/10 of all production, creating a massive transfer of wealth from laity to clergy. This wealth funded not just religious activities, but also education, charity, and architectural projects. The church became Scandinavia's largest landowner, controlling estates that had belonged to pagan temples or been donated by converts seeking salvation. Christian morality challenged fundamental aspects of Viking culture. The warrior ethic that celebrated violence conflicted with Christian teachings about peace and forgiveness. The emphasis on honor and revenge that structured social relations contradicted Christian humility and turning the other cheek. The pragmatic approach to religion, where gods were honored for their usefulness, clashed with Christian demands for exclusive devotion. Reconciling these contradictions required reinterpreting both Christianity and traditional culture. The cult of saints provided a bridge between pagan and Christian practice. Saints served functions similar to pagan gods, offering protection and intervention in specific situations. Saint Olaf became Norway's patron, his cult combining Christian sanctity with traditional ideas about sacred kingship. Local saints emerged from questionable historical foundations, often representing Christianized versions of local pagan deities or heroes. These cults allowed continued veneration of traditional figures within a Christian framework. Pilgrimage emerged as a new form of religious expression that resonated with Scandinavian travel traditions. Vikings had always been travelers seeking wealth and glory in foreign lands. Pilgrimage transformed this impulse into spiritual journey. Scandinavians walked to Rome, Jerusalem, and Santiago de Compostela, bringing back relics, indulgences, and stories that enhanced their status. The pilgrimage to Nidaros, where St. Olaf was buried, became Scandinavia's own sacred journey. The transformation of burial practices revealed changing religious beliefs. Pagan ship burials and grave goods gave way to Christian churchyard interments. The orientation of graves shifted from various directions to uniform east-west alignment. Grave goods disappeared, replaced by simple shrouds. Yet some pagan practices persisted. Runic inscriptions on Christian memorial stones invoked both Christ and Thor. Some graves contained both crosses and hammers, suggesting continued religious uncertainty. Women's roles changed significantly with Christian conversion. The new faith eliminated their roles as pagan priestesses and prophets. Christian marriage laws reduced their autonomy, requiring male guardianship and limiting divorce rights. Yet Christianity also condemned infanticide, protecting female infants previously vulnerable to exposure. Convents offered alternatives to marriage, allowing some women to pursue education and achieve positions of authority within religious communities. The literate culture introduced by Christianity transformed Scandinavian intellectual life. Latin literacy opened access to European learning, connecting Scandinavia to broader intellectual currents. Scandinavian students traveled to Paris and Bologna, returning with advanced education in theology, law, and medicine. The runic alphabet continued for everyday use, but Latin became the language of administration, diplomacy, and scholarship. The preservation of pagan literature in Christian Iceland created a unique historical record. Icelandic scribes, mostly clerics, wrote down Eddas and sagas that preserved pre-Christian mythology and heroic traditions. They approached this material with complex motivations, seeking to preserve cultural heritage while demonstrating Christianity's superiority. The result was a body of literature that maintained pagan narratives within Christian interpretative frameworks. Snorri Sturluson, writing in the 13th century, exemplified this Christian preservation of pagan culture. His prose Edda provided a systematic account of Norse mythology, framed as ancient errors that Christianity had corrected. By presenting the gods as deified heroes rather than demons, Snorri made pagan mythology safe for Christian audiences. His work ensured that Norse mythology survived when comparable traditions in other converted cultures disappeared. The conversion period saw Scandinavian art evolve from purely pagan to syncretic to distinctly Christian forms. The Ernest style, developing in the 11th century, showed sinuous animals and serpents that could represent either pagan dragons or Christian symbols of evil conquered by faith. Runic stones commemorated Christians with inscriptions invoking God's help, while maintaining traditional memorial formats. Metalwork combined Christian crosses with traditional interlace patterns, creating objects that spoke to both traditions. The synthesis of Christian and pagan elements created a distinctive Nordic Christianity. Christ was portrayed as a warrior king conquering death, rather than a suffering servant. The cross became a victor's standard rather than an instrument of torture. Heaven was described in terms reminiscent of Valhalla, a hall where warriors feasted with their lord. This militarized Christianity appealed to warrior aristocracies while maintaining essential Christian doctrines. Church organization in Scandinavia developed along national lines, resisting subordination to German or English ecclesiastical authority. The establishment of archbishoprics in Lund, Nidaros, and Uppsala created independent Scandinavian churches answering directly to Rome. This ecclesiastical independence reinforced political independence, allowing Scandinavian kingdoms to resist Holy Roman Empire expansion. The church became a vehicle for national identity as much as religious expression. The economic integration of Scandinavia into Christian Europe accelerated after conversion. Christian merchants were more willing to trade with fellow Christians. Church networks facilitated commercial relationships across political boundaries. Standardized weights and measures promoted by the Church simplified international trade. The moral authority of the Church enforced contracts and reduced commercial fraud. Christianity became an economic advantage that reinforced religious change. As the 11th century progressed, the violent resistance to Christianity faded into memory. New generations grew up knowing only Christianity, even if folk practices preserved pagan elements. The church became central to community life, marking seasonal celebrations, life transitions, and social gatherings. The parish system organized rural life, providing structure beyond kinship and local lordship. Christianity was no longer foreign but fundamentally Scandinavian. The transformation was not complete or uniform. Regional variations persisted, with some areas maintaining stronger pagan traditions than others. Rural districts preserved folk practices that worried church authorities for centuries. Seasonal celebrations maintained pagan elements despite Christian overlays. The Finnish and Sami populations in Scandinavia's northern reaches remained largely pagan, creating religious frontiers within nominally Christian kingdoms. The success of Christianization ultimately rested on its ability to adapt to Scandinavian conditions rather than simply replacing existing structures. The Church absorbed and transformed pagan practices rather than eliminating them entirely. It provided new justifications for royal authority while maintaining traditional limitations on power. It offered international connections while preserving local autonomy. This synthesis created a Christianity that was both universal and distinctly Scandinavian. By 1100, the transformation was essentially complete. The grandchildren of Vikings who had raided monasteries now built and endowed them. The descendants of berserkers who fought in Odin's name now crusaded for Christ. The Skalds who had composed praise poems for pagan warlords now celebrated Christian kings. The North had joined Christendom, ending its role as Europe's pagan periphery. Yet in joining the Christian mainstream, Scandinavia had also transformed it, creating new forms of Christian expression that would influence European Christianity for centuries to come. The longships still prowled the grey waters between England and Denmark, but their purpose had transformed. Where once they carried raiders seeking silver and slaves, now they transported administrators, merchants, and royal messengers, maintaining an empire that stretched across the North Sea. The man who commanded these ships, Cnut the Great, embodied the evolution of Viking ambition from destruction to dominion. He was no mere raider, but an emperor whose realm encompassed England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, creating the most powerful Scandinavian polity that would ever exist. Cnut's path to empire began in violence typical of the late Viking age. His father, Svein Forkbeard of Denmark, had spent decades raiding England, extracting increasingly massive payments of Danegeld from the weakening Anglo-Saxon kingdom. These were not the hit-and-run raids of earlier centuries, but systematic campaigns of extortion backed by professional armies. When Svein launched his conquest of England in 1013, he brought not just warriors but a political vision of united North Sea dominion under Danish rule. The English kingdom that faced Svein's invasion was already fractured by decades of Viking pressure and internal weakness. King Aethelred, known derisively as the Unready, had alienated his nobles through incompetence and paranoia. His massacre of Danish settlers on St. Brice's Day in 1002, intended to eliminate potential fifth columnists, had instead provided Svein with justification for conquest. When Svein's forces landed, many English nobles chose Danish rule over continued chaos under Aethelred. Svein's sudden death in 1014 nearly derailed Danish ambitions. The English nobles recalled Aethelred from Norman exile, whilst Svein's army proclaimed the young Cnut as king. At perhaps 20 years old, Cnut faced a crisis that would have destroyed a lesser leader. The English were resurgent under Aethelred's son Edmund Ironside. The Danish army was restless without pay, and rivals in Denmark challenged his succession. Cnut withdrew to Denmark, but this was strategic retreat, not defeat. The army Cnut assembled for his return to England in 1015 represented the culmination of Viking military evolution. This was not a traditional raiding force or even the great army of the previous century. Cnut commanded perhaps 10,000 professional warriors drawn from across Scandinavia, organized into a disciplined force with sophisticated command structure. The fleet that transported them numbered over 200 ships, a naval force that gave Cnut absolute control of the seas around Britain. The campaign of 1015–1016 demonstrated how Viking warfare had evolved from raid to conquest. Cnut systematically reduced English resistance through coordinated land and naval operations. His ships controlled rivers, preventing English forces from concentrating. His army avoided decisive battles when disadvantageous, instead devastating regions that supported Edmund Ironside. This was warfare designed not for plunder, but for political submission, destroying the economic basis of resistance while offering peace to those who submitted. The Battle of Asandun in October 1016 proved decisive. Cnut's forces, supposedly aided by treachery from English nobles, routed Edmund's army. Yet rather than pursue total victory, Cnut negotiated. The Treaty of Deerhurst divided England, with Edmund keeping Wessex while Cnut took Mercia and Northumbria. When Edmund died weeks later, possibly assassinated though this remains unproven, Cnut inherited the entire kingdom without further bloodshed. This pragmatic approach to power marked Cnut as a new type of Viking leader. Cnut's consolidation of power in England revealed sophisticated political thinking. Rather than imposing Danish rule through force, he pursued reconciliation and integration. He married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, legitimizing his rule through continuity with the previous dynasty. He retained English laws and administrators while placing Danes in key positions to ensure loyalty. He divided England into 4 great earldoms, balancing English and Danish nobles to prevent any faction from becoming too powerful. The relationship Cnut cultivated with the English Church proved particularly astute. Rather than the ambivalent Christianity of earlier Viking rulers, Cnut presented himself as a devoted Christian king. He patronized monasteries, commissioned churches, and made a pilgrimage to Rome in 1027. His law codes emphasized Christian morality and justice. This religious devotion was certainly political, but contemporary sources suggest genuine personal faith. Cnut understood that controlling England required the Church's support. Denmark demanded Cnut's attention even as he consolidated English rule. His brother Harald had ruled Denmark during Cnut's English campaigns, but died in 1018. Cnut sailed to Denmark with English forces, a reversal of the traditional pattern of Scandinavian invasion. He quickly established control, but Denmark proved harder to govern from a distance than to conquer. The German Empire threatened from the south, Swedish rivals pressed from the east, and Norwegian independence challenged Danish hegemony. The conquest of Norway demonstrated both the Cnut's power and the limits of Viking imperial ambition. Olaf Haraldsson had ruled Norway since 1015, building an independent kingdom that challenged Danish dominance in Scandinavia. Cnut's invasion in 1028 succeeded through bribery as much as force. Norwegian nobles, resentful of Olaf's harsh Christian reforms and centralization efforts, accepted Cnut's gold and promises of autonomy. Olaf fled to Russia, and Cnut added Norway to his empire without major battles. Yet Norway proved impossible to control directly. Cnut installed his son Svein as viceroy, with his English concubine Elfgifu as regent. Their harsh rule and foreign origins sparked immediate resistance. When Olaf returned in 1030, many Norwegians who had opposed him now saw him as a liberator. His death at the Battle of Stiklestad created a martyrdom that transformed him into Saint Olaf, Norway's eternal king. The Norwegian rebellion that followed forced Cnut to accept Magnus, Olaf's son, as king under nominal Danish overlordship. The administration of Cnut's empire required innovations in governance that influenced medieval European development. He maintained separate administrative systems in each kingdom while creating overarching imperial structures. His household included English, Danish, and Norwegian nobles who formed a proto-imperial court. Laws were harmonized where possible while respecting local traditions. This flexible federalism allowed diverse peoples to accept Cnut's rule while maintaining their distinct identities. The economic integration of Cnut's empire created unprecedented prosperity. English wool flowed to Scandinavian markets. Danish merchants gained privileged access to English ports. Norwegian timber supplied English shipbuilding. The standardization of coinage across the empire facilitated trade. Cnut's peace, enforced by naval supremacy, eliminated piracy that had plagued North Sea commerce. This economic interdependence reinforced political unity more effectively than military force. The cultural synthesis within Cnut's empire produced lasting innovations. English administrative sophistication influenced Scandinavian governance. Scandinavian military traditions shaped English warfare. The fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian art created new styles that spread throughout the empire. Literature crossed linguistic boundaries, with English scribes recording Scandinavian traditions and Danish skalds composing verses for English courts. Cnut's international diplomacy elevated Scandinavian rulers to European prominence. His pilgrimage to Rome in 1027 for Emperor Conrad II's coronation demonstrated his status among Europe's elite. He negotiated directly with the Pope, securing privileges for English and Scandinavian pilgrims. His alliance with the German Empire through his daughter's marriage to Conrad's son created a power bloc that dominated northern Europe. Scandinavian rulers were no longer barbarian outsiders but central players in European politics. The evolution of Viking military forces under Cnut represented their final transformation from raiders to professional soldiers. The housecarls, Cnut's elite guard, were not seasonal warriors but full-time professionals. They received regular pay, lived in barracks, and followed strict military discipline. Their equipment was standardized and sophisticated: mail hauberks, conical helmets, the distinctive two-handed Danish axes, and large round shields. This professionalization influenced military development throughout Europe. Naval technology reached its Viking Age peak during Cnut's reign. His ships were larger and more sophisticated than earlier longships, designed for transporting armies rather than raiding parties. Some vessels could carry over 100 warriors with their equipment and supplies. The coordination of fleet movements across the North Sea required advanced navigation and communication systems. Cnut's navy was not just transportation, but a strategic force that could blockade ports, control sea lanes, and project power throughout his empire. The legal developments under Cnut synthesized Scandinavian and English traditions into new forms. His law codes, issued for both England and Denmark, balanced traditional compensatory justice with Christian moral requirements. They addressed contemporary issues like trade regulation, currency standardization, and international jurisdiction. These laws influenced legal development in both England and Scandinavia, creating precedents that would endure for centuries. Women in Cnut's empire experienced complex changes in status and opportunity. Emma of Normandy wielded significant political influence as Queen of both England and Denmark. Ælfgifu of Northampton governed Norway as regent, though unsuccessfully. Elite women managed vast estates during their husbands' frequent absences on imperial business. Yet Christian marriage laws were reducing women's traditional autonomy, particularly regarding divorce and property rights. The empire created new opportunities while imposing new constraints. The succession crisis that followed Cnut's death in 1035 revealed the fragility of personal empires. His sons Harald Hardrada and Harthacnut fought for control, dividing the empire their father had united. Harald seized England while Harthacnut retained Denmark. Their conflict prevented either from maintaining Norwegian control, which passed to Magnus Olafsson. When Harthacnut died childless in 1042, the English throne passed to Edward the Confessor, son of Ethelred, and Emma, ending Danish rule in England. The collapse of Cnut's empire did not mean the end of Scandinavian power projection. Norwegian kings continued to intervene in Scottish and Irish politics. Danish rulers maintained claims to the English throne. Swedish Vikings still dominated Baltic trade routes. The infrastructure Cnut had created, administrative systems, trade networks, diplomatic relationships, persisted even as political unity fractured. The idea of North Sea Empire would inspire ambitious rulers for generations. Magnus of Norway and Svein Estridsson of Denmark spent decades fighting for the Cnut's legacy. Their wars devastated both kingdoms without producing decisive victory. The resources wasted in these conflicts weakened Scandinavia, just as European kingdoms were centralizing and strengthening. The dream of reuniting Cnut's empire distracted Scandinavian rulers from defending against German expansion and internal consolidation. Harald Hardrada of Norway represented the last great Viking adventurer in the traditional mold. His career spanned the Viking world from Russia to the Mediterranean. He served in the Varangian Guard, accumulated vast wealth in Byzantine service, and returned to claim the Norwegian throne in 1046. His reign combined traditional Viking aggression with sophisticated statecraft learned in Constantinople. He built Norway's first stone churches, founded Oslo, and created a royal administration that would endure for centuries. Harald's ambitions extended beyond Norway. He spent years fighting Denmark for dominance in Scandinavia, achieving tactical victories but strategic stalemate. His claims to England through Magnus's alleged agreement with Harthacnut provided justification for invasion. The expedition he launched in 1066 represented the final great Viking attempt to conquer England, mobilizing resources that demonstrated Norway's continued military capacity even at the Viking Age's end. The transformation of Scandinavian kingdoms during this period went beyond military adventures. Royal administrations developed bureaucracies modeled on English and German examples. Coinage became standardized with royal monopolies on minting. Law codes were written down and systematically enforced. Towns grew from trading posts into administrative centers with royally appointed officials. These developments mark Scandinavia's transition from Viking Age tribalism to medieval monarchy. The Church's role in this transformation was crucial. Bishops became royal advisors and administrators. Monasteries served as centers of literacy and learning. Church law supplemented and sometimes superseded traditional law. Tithes provided regular revenue that reduced royal dependence on plunder. The Church legitimized royal authority while constraining its exercise through moral requirements. This partnership between Crown and Church would define medieval Scandinavian politics. International trade networks established during the Viking Age evolved into permanent commercial relationships. The Hanseatic League would later dominate Baltic trade, but its foundations rested on routes Vikings had established. English wool trade with Flanders followed patterns Cnut had promoted. Norwegian stockfish became a staple food across Europe, traded through networks Vikings had created. The commercial infrastructure of medieval northern Europe was largely Viking in origin. Cultural exchanges during Cnut's empire left permanent marks on all participants. English words entered Scandinavian languages through administrative borrowing. Scandinavian place names covered northern England, permanent reminders of settlement and rule. Artistic styles merged so thoroughly that distinguishing Anglo-Saxon from Scandinavian elements became impossible. This cultural fusion created regional identities that transcended political boundaries. The military innovations of this period influenced European warfare far beyond Scandinavia. The Danish axe became a feared weapon across Europe, adopted by various armies including the Anglo-Saxons at Hastings. Viking ship designs influenced naval development throughout northern Europe. The concept of professional military service, exemplified by the housecarls, spread to other kingdoms. Even as the Viking Age ended, its military legacy continued evolving. The end of the North Sea Empire marked a fundamental shift in European geopolitics. No Scandinavian ruler would again control territories across the North Sea. The center of European power shifted south and west toward France and the German Empire. Scandinavia became peripheral to European development, its energies turned inward toward consolidation rather than expansion. The age of Viking dominance was ending, replaced by the age of medieval European kingdoms. Yet Cnut's empire left legacies beyond its political failure. It demonstrated that diverse peoples could be united under capable leadership. It proved that Scandinavians could govern as effectively as they could conquer. It showed that trade and administration could create prosperity exceeding anything plunder could provide. These lessons influenced Scandinavian development long after the empire's collapse, shaping kingdoms that would endure into the modern era. As 1066 approached, the Viking Age was drawing to its dramatic close. The players were taking their positions for the final act. Harald Hardrada prepared his invasion fleet in Norwegian fjords. Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon earl who had seized the English throne, watched anxiously for threats from north and south. William of Normandy, descendant of Viking settlers who had become French nobles, assembled his own invasion force. The stage was set for battles that would end one age and begin another, transforming Vikings from contemporary threats into historical memories. The North Sea Empire had represented the apex of Viking political achievement, the moment when Scandinavian power dominated northern Europe. Its collapse did not diminish this achievement but transformed it, as Viking energy turned from expansion to consolidation, from raiding to ruling, from pagan barbarism to Christian civilization. The Vikings were becoming Europeans, and Europe would never be the same for having known them. The morning mist hung low over the River Derwent on September 25, 1066, as Harald Hardrada surveyed the peaceful Yorkshire countryside from Stamford Bridge. The Norwegian king, perhaps the most famous Viking warrior of his generation, had no reason to expect battle that day. His army had destroyed the northern English forces at Fulford 5 days earlier, York had surrendered, and hostages were coming to formalize submission. His men had left their mail armor with the ships at Rickhall, 12 miles away. The warm autumn sun promised a day for negotiation, not combat. Harald embodied everything the Viking Age had been and everything it was becoming. He had fought in Kievan Rus as a teenager, commanded the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, and amassed legendary wealth through Byzantine campaigns. He stood supposedly 7 feet tall, a giant even among the tall Norwegians, with a flowing moustache and battle scars that told stories of campaigns from Sicily to Jerusalem. At 51, he had ruled Norway for 20 years, transforming it from a collection of feuding regions into a centralized kingdom with a regulated coinage, written laws, and a church hierarchy. His invasion of England represented the convergence of old Viking ambitions and new medieval realities. Harold claimed the English throne through a convoluted series of agreements allegedly made between Magnus of Norway and Harthacnut of Denmark decades earlier. The legal justifications mattered less than the opportunity. England's new king, Harold Godwinson, faced threats from every direction. Duke William of Normandy was gathering an invasion fleet across the Channel. The Welsh princes were restive. Harald Hardrada saw his chance to recreate Cnut's North Sea Empire. The army Harold brought to England was not a traditional Viking raiding force, but a professional military machine. Contemporary sources suggest between 9,000 and 15,000 warriors carried in 300 ships. These were not farmer raiders seeking seasonal plunder, but professional soldiers, many veterans of Harold's long wars against Denmark. They fought in the evolved Viking style, combining traditional Scandinavian infantry tactics with innovations learned across Europe and beyond. Tostig Godwinson's presence in Harold's army represented the complex politics of 1066. Brother to King Harold, Tostig had been Earl of Northumbria until his misrule sparked rebellion. Exiled and bitter, he offered Harold local knowledge and a claim to legitimacy. His defection exemplified how Viking invasions had evolved from pure foreign conquest to intervention in domestic political conflicts. Vikings were no longer external threats, but players in internal English power struggles. The campaign began promisingly. Harold's fleet sailed up the Humber and Ouse rivers, using the waterways that Vikings had controlled for 2 centuries. At Fulford on September 20th, his forces met the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria in pitched battle. The English fought well initially, but Harold's experience proved decisive. His forces executed a complex flanking maneuver that shattered the English line. The northern earls fled with massive casualties, leaving York defenceless. York's surrender seemed to confirm Harold's destiny. The city that had been the Viking capital of northern England for centuries welcomed another Scandinavian conqueror. Harold demanded hostages and supplies but did not sack the city, presenting himself as legitimate king rather than foreign invader. He arranged to receive additional hostages at Stamford Bridge, a crossing point on the Derwent where roads from all directions converged. Harold Godwinson's response demonstrated how English military capabilities had evolved since the early Viking raids. Learning of the Norwegian invasion while watching for William of Normandy on the south coast, Harold executed one of the most remarkable forced marches in medieval military history. His army covered the 200 miles from London to Yorkshire in just 4 days, gathering reinforcements as it moved. This speed was possible only through the Roman road system and an organized logistics network that could supply fast-moving forces. The English army that appeared at Stamford Bridge on that September morning caught the Vikings completely unprepared. Many Norwegian warriors were on the west side of the river, separated from the main force. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a single Viking warrior held the narrow bridge against the entire English army, killing 40 attackers before an Englishman floated under the bridge in a barrel and thrust a spear through the planks. This story, possibly legendary, captured the individual heroism that characterized Viking warrior culture, even as that culture was ending. Harold organized his scattered forces into a defensive circle on the rising ground east of the bridge. His personal banner, called Landwaster, flew at the center where he stood with his household guard. The battle that followed was not the hit-and-run raid of early Viking warfare, but a grinding clash of shield walls that lasted hours. Both armies fought in essentially similar styles, showing how Viking and English military traditions had converged over centuries of conflict and cultural exchange. The battle turned on moments of individual combat that would have been familiar to warriors from the sagas. Harold Godwinson supposedly offered Tostig his earldom back if he would switch sides, and when asked what Harald Hardrada would receive, replied, 7 feet of English earth, or more, as he is taller than other men. Harold himself fought with berserk fury, wielding his 2-handed sword with such force that neither armor nor shields could withstand his blows. Yet this individual prowess proved insufficient against disciplined English forces fighting for their homeland. An arrow to the throat ended Harald Hardrada's life and, symbolically, the Viking Age itself. His death created panic in the Norwegian ranks, though fighting continued until dusk. The slaughter was immense. Of the 300 ships that had brought the invasion force, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Tostig died alongside his Viking allies, his body identified only by a wart between his shoulder blades. The cream of Norwegian military nobility perished on that Yorkshire field. Harold Godwinson's victory celebration was brief. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed at Pevensey Bay. Harold's forced march south and the Battle of Hastings, 19 days after Stamford Bridge, would determine England's fate. Harold's death at Hastings, killed by warriors who were themselves descendants of Vikings, marked history's great irony. The last Anglo-Saxon king died defeating one Viking invasion, only to fall to another Viking descendant's conquest. William of Normandy represented the transformation of Vikings into European nobility. His ancestor Rollo had been a Viking raider who received lands from the French king in 911. Within 5 generations, these Norse raiders had become French aristocrats, adopting French language, culture, and military innovations while maintaining the ambition and organizational skills of their Viking heritage. The Norman conquest of England was, in a sense, the final and most successful Viking invasion, though the conquerors no longer considered themselves Vikings. The Norman transformation illustrated the Viking Age's true legacy. Across Europe, Viking descendants had integrated into local societies while maintaining distinct influences. The Rurikids ruled Russian principalities. Scandinavian bloodlines flowed through Irish, Scottish, and English nobility. Sicily and southern Italy bore the mark of Norman adventurers who had carved out kingdoms through the same combination of violence and political acumen their Viking ancestors had employed. The contrast between Harald Hardrada's traditional Viking invasion and William's Norman conquest revealed how European warfare had evolved. William brought a combined arms force of cavalry, infantry, and archers, employing sophisticated tactics learned from conflicts across France. His administration of conquered England used written records, castle fortifications, and feudal obligations unknown to earlier Vikings. The Domesday Book, compiled 20 years after the conquest, represented administrative sophistication impossible in the Viking Age proper. In Scandinavia itself, the aftermath of Stamford Bridge accelerated the transformation from Viking Age to medieval kingdom. Norway, devastated by the loss of so much of its military elite, turned inward. Harald's son Magnus ruled jointly with his brother Olaf Kyrre, who earned his nickname the Peaceful by avoiding foreign adventures. Olaf's 25-year reign saw Norway develop urban centres, establish bishoprics, and build stone churches. The energy that had once gone into raiding now built domestic infrastructure. Denmark, under Svein Estridsson and his successors, also evolved from Viking raiding to medieval monarchy. Svein's sons, who ruled in succession, focused on internal development and defending against German expansion rather than foreign conquest. They built churches, established monasteries, and created administrative systems modelled on German examples. The Danish kingdom that emerged was Christian, literate, and integrated into European diplomatic networks, bearing little resemblance to the Viking raiders of earlier centuries. Sweden's transformation proceeded more gradually, with regional variations that reflected the kingdom's decentralized nature. The Swedish Vikings, who had dominated Baltic trade routes, evolved into merchant communities that would eventually form the Hanseatic League. The Varangian route to Constantinople remained active but increasingly commercial rather than military. Swedish nobles, who might once have sought fortune through Viking raids, now served as mercenaries in European armies or administrators in medieval courts. The Atlantic colonies faced different challenges as the Viking Age ended. Iceland maintained its independence and unique governmental system, but suffered from isolation as Norwegian trade declined. The Icelandic Commonwealth's golden age of literary production was beginning, with sagas being composed that would preserve Viking Age memory for posterity. Yet, economically and politically, Iceland was becoming marginal, dependent on irregular Norwegian trade and vulnerable to eventual Norwegian domination. Greenland's isolation was even more pronounced. The colonies there depended entirely on trade with Norway for iron, timber, and grain. As Norwegian attention turned inward and European demand for Arctic products declined, Greenland's connections to Europe weakened. The colonies that had represented Viking exploration's furthest reach began their slow decline toward extinction, though this process would take centuries to complete. The Orkney and Shetland Islands, along with the Hebrides and parts of Scotland, retained strong Norse character, even as they came under increasing Scottish influence. The Earldom of Orkney maintained quasi-independence, with jarls who balanced loyalty to Norwegian kings with accommodation of Scottish power. These islands preserved Norse language and customs longer than anywhere outside Scandinavia, creating hybrid cultures that combined Celtic and Norse traditions. In Ireland, the Viking-founded cities of Dublin, Cork, Waterford, Wexford and Limerick had evolved into Irish-Norse communities, thoroughly integrated into Irish politics. The Osman, as these Irish Vikings were called, maintained distinct identity while participating fully in Irish conflicts and alliances. They preserved Scandinavian trading connections while adopting Irish language and customs. Dublin remained one of Europe's significant ports, its Viking foundation forgotten as its Irish character strengthened. The transformation of Viking military traditions into medieval European warfare was complete by 1100. The Viking round shield gave way to the kite shield that better protected cavalry. The broad Viking sword evolved into more specialized designs for mounted and foot combat. The battle axe remained distinctly Scandinavian, but was adopted across Europe. Viking ship designs influenced naval development, but were superseded by vessels better suited to carrying horses and siege equipment. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople represented the final repository of pure Viking military tradition. Scandinavian and English warriors continued to travel the eastern road, seeking fortune in Byzantine service. After 1066, the Guard recruited heavily from Anglo-Saxon nobles fleeing Norman rule, creating an exile community that preserved Anglo-Scandinavian military traditions in Byzantine service. Harald Hardrada's former comrades trained new generations of northern warriors in the evolved Viking fighting style. Legal and governmental structures across former Viking territories showed lasting Scandinavian influence. The hundred and wapentake administrative divisions in England derived from Scandinavian models. Thing assemblies evolved into parliamentary bodies in Iceland and the Isle of Man. Scandinavian legal concepts of compensation rather than punishment influenced English common law development. The jury system may have originated in Scandinavian legal procedures, though this remains debated. Language provided the most pervasive Viking legacy. Hundreds of Norse words entered English, particularly in northern dialects. Place names across Britain, Ireland and Normandy preserved Norse linguistic fossils. Personal names of Scandinavian origin became common across northern Europe. The simplified grammar that characterized Middle English resulted partly from contact between Old English and Old Norse speakers. Modern English owes much of its character to Viking linguistic influence. Economic patterns established during the Viking Age persisted long after raiders became merchants. Trade routes connecting Scandinavia to Russia, Byzantium, and the Islamic world continued operating through medieval times. The emphasis on portable wealth that characterized Viking society influenced European monetary development. The Vikings' use of silver by weight rather than coin face value introduced concepts of intrinsic value that would influence European economic thought. Religious syncretism created during the conversion period left permanent marks on Scandinavian Christianity. Churches were built on pagan sacred sites, incorporating pre-Christian symbolism into Christian contexts. Folk beliefs about elves, trolls, and other supernatural beings persisted alongside Christian doctrine. Seasonal celebrations maintained pagan elements despite Christian overlays. The Christianity that emerged in Scandinavia was distinctly northern, influenced by its pagan substrate. The role of women in post-Viking Scandinavian society reflected both continuity and change. While Christian doctrine reduced female autonomy in some areas, particularly regarding divorce, Norse traditions of female property rights persisted. Scandinavian women maintained greater economic independence than their counterparts in many European societies. The strong female figures of the sagas, whether historical or literary, provided models of female agency unusual in medieval European literature. Art and material culture showed the gradual transformation from Viking to medieval European styles. The animal interlace that characterized Viking Age metalwork evolved into Romanesque decorative patterns. Runic inscriptions gave way to Latin letters, though runes persisted in folk contexts. Building styles evolved from wooden halls to stone churches and castles, yet distinctly Scandinavian elements persisted, creating regional styles that marked Northern European art for centuries. The historical memory of the Viking Age began forming even as that age ended. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 1070s, portrayed Scandinavians as noble pagans corrupted by conversion. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle presented Vikings as God's scourge on sinful Christians. Irish annalists recorded Viking depredations alongside their integration into Irish society. These varied perspectives would shape how future generations understood the Viking Age. As the 11th century closed, Scandinavia had completed its transformation from the periphery to an integrated part of European Christendom. Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish kings participated in crusades, made pilgrimages to Rome, and married into European royal families. Scandinavian bishops attended church councils, students studied at European universities, and merchants participated in continental trade networks. The isolation that had allowed distinct Viking culture to develop had ended. The last Viking raids, sporadic and unsuccessful, occurred in the early 12th century. Magnus Barefoot of Norway raided in the Irish Sea between 1098 and 1103, attempting to recreate Viking glory. His death in an Irish ambush demonstrated that the age of Viking raiding had passed. European defences had evolved, castle fortifications neutralized Viking mobility advantages, and professional armies could respond more effectively to raids. The Vikings' victims had learned their lessons too well. By 1100, the transformation was complete. The descendants of Vikings were becoming the ancestors of modern Scandinavians. They retained pride in their Viking heritage while embracing European civilization. The sagas being written in Iceland would preserve Viking memory, but as history rather than living tradition. The long ships that had carried terror across Europe rotted in harbours or were broken up for building material. The Viking Age had ended not in defeat, but in transformation, as the raiders and conquerors of the 9th century became the kings and merchants of the 12th. The North Atlantic wind still carries whispers of dragon-prowed ships, though centuries have passed since the last Vikings sailed into the mists of history. Their age ended not with apocalyptic defeat, but with gradual absorption into the European mainstream they had once terrorized. Yet the Vikings left marks on our world so profound that we encounter their legacy daily without recognition, speaking their words, living under legal systems they influenced, and carrying their genes in populations from Reykjavik to Kiev, from Dublin to Constantinople. The linguistic legacy of the Vikings permeates modern English so thoroughly that we cannot express basic thoughts without using words they brought to British shores. When we speak of skill, knife, husband, wife, egg, cake, birth, death, law, and hundreds of other fundamental concepts, we use Norse words that replaced or supplemented Anglo-Saxon terms. The pronouns they, their, and them came from Old Norse, so basic to English that we cannot form sentences without Viking linguistic influence. Even the word berserk, describing uncontrolled fury, preserves memory of Viking warriors who fought in bare-shirt rage. This linguistic invasion succeeded where military conquest ultimately failed. While Viking political control over England ended with the Norman conquest, their words conquered English permanently. The simplified grammar of Middle English, which evolved into modern English's relatively simple structure compared to other Germanic languages, resulted partly from Old Norse speakers and Old English speakers needing to communicate across linguistic barriers. They dropped complex grammatical endings that differed between the languages while preserving shared vocabulary roots, creating a streamlined language that would become the world's lingua franca. Place names across the former Viking world preserved their presence like archaeological artifacts embedded in landscape. In England alone, over 2,000 place names have Scandinavian origins. Every village ending in by, meaning farm or village, thorp, meaning hamlet, thwaite, meaning meadow, or toft, meaning homestead, marks Viking settlement. Yorkshire's Wetherby, Lincolnshire's Scunthorpe, and Cumbria's Bassenthwaite are not just places, but historical documents written on the land itself. These names map Viking settlement patterns more accurately than any chronicle. The legal systems of England, Scotland, and indeed much of the English-speaking world bear Viking fingerprints in fundamental concepts. The word law itself comes from Old Norse log, and with it came ideas about legal procedure that transformed Anglo-Saxon justice. The concept of a jury of 12 men, while debated in its origins, shows remarkable similarity to Viking legal procedures, where 12 men would judge cases at thing assemblies. The idea that law emerged from community consensus rather than royal decree, central to English common law development, reflected Viking political traditions where things created law through collective decision. Modern Scandinavian democracy owes direct debts to Viking Age assemblies. Iceland's Althing, established in 930, continues to meet as the world's oldest surviving parliament, though its function has evolved from medieval commonwealth to modern democracy. The Norwegian Storting, the Danish Folketing, and the Swedish Riksdag all trace conceptual roots to Viking Age assemblies, where free men gathered to make collective decisions. These institutions preserved the idea that governance required consent from the governed, a concept that would influence democratic development worldwide. The Isle of Man's Tynwald, established by Vikings over 1,000 years ago, still meets annually in an outdoor ceremony that preserves Viking governmental traditions. Laws are proclaimed in English and Manx Gaelic from Tynwald Hill, a practice maintaining Viking custom where laws were recited publicly to ensure all free men knew their rights and obligations. This living connection to Viking governance demonstrates how their political innovations transcended their age. Genetic studies have revealed the biological legacy of Viking expansion with precision impossible before modern DNA analysis. In Iceland, the Y chromosome patterns show predominantly Norse male ancestry, while mitochondrial DNA reveals significant Celtic female ancestry, confirming saga accounts of Vikings taking Irish and Scottish women as wives and concubines during colonization. The Icelandic population, isolated for centuries, provides geneticists with a living laboratory for studying Viking Age demographics. Across Britain and Ireland, genetic markers tell stories of Viking settlement that complement historical records. The Orkney Islands show the highest proportion of Scandinavian ancestry in the British Isles, with some populations showing over 25% Norse heritage. The Western Isles of Scotland, Eastern England, and areas around Viking-founded Irish cities show elevated Scandinavian genetic contributions. Even in Russia, where Slavic populations vastly outnumbered Scandinavian settlers, genetic traces of the Rus Vikings persist in modern populations. The unexpected genetic revelation came from Normandy, where despite the region's name and Viking foundation, modern populations show minimal Scandinavian genetic contribution. This suggests that Rollo and his followers represented a small warrior elite who adopted local marriage patterns rather than maintaining ethnic separation. The Normans who conquered England in 1066 were culturally transformed Vikings rather than genetically Scandinavian, demonstrating how Viking influence transcended biological inheritance. The preservation of Viking Age literature in medieval Iceland created a unique window into their worldview. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, preserved oral traditions stretching back to the Viking Age. These texts, including Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda and the anonymous poetic Edda, maintained Norse mythology with detail and sophistication unmatched in other converted Germanic cultures. Without Icelandic preservation, we would know Thor, Odin, and Loki only through scattered references and hostile Christian descriptions. The sagas provided more than mythology. They preserved Viking Age social values, legal procedures, and historical memory. Egil's saga, Njal's saga, and dozens of others presented complex psychological portraits of Viking Age individuals struggling with honor, vengeance, love, and loyalty. While these literary works were composed centuries after the events they described and filtered through Christian scribal culture, they maintained authentic elements of Viking Age mentality and social structure that would otherwise be lost. Modern popular culture's fascination with Vikings, while often historically inaccurate, reflects the enduring power of their narrative. From Wagner's operas to Marvel's Thor, from television dramas to video games, Vikings capture contemporary imagination as few historical peoples do. This cultural presence, however distorted, keeps Viking memory alive in ways academic history cannot. The popular image of horned helmets, which Vikings never wore, and savage barbarity, which oversimplifies their complex culture, nonetheless maintains public awareness of Viking historical significance. Archaeological discoveries continue to revolutionize understanding of Viking society, often contradicting literary sources and popular stereotypes. The excavation of Viking Dublin revealed sophisticated urban planning, craft specialization, and international trade connections that challenged images of Vikings as purely destructive raiders. The Coppergate excavation in York uncovered Viking Age workshops producing goods from leather, metal, glass, and amber, demonstrating economic complexity rivaling any contemporary European city. Ship burials discovered at Gokstad and Oseberg in Norway provided perfectly preserved examples of Viking Age material culture. These vessels, buried with their wealthy owners, contained textiles, wooden objects, and organic materials usually lost to decomposition. They revealed artistic sophistication in wood carving, textile production, and metalwork that placed Viking craftsmen among Europe's finest artisans. The ships themselves demonstrated engineering excellence that enabled Viking expansion. Recent discoveries have particularly illuminated Viking women's roles. Female warrior burials, identified through skeletal analysis and grave goods, suggest some women participated in warfare, though their frequency remains debated. More significantly, evidence of women as traders, craft producers, and property owners challenges Victorian assumptions about Viking society being exclusively male-dominated. DNA analysis of remains in warrior graves, previously assumed male, has revealed female skeletons, forcing reconsideration of gender roles in Viking society. The economic impact of Viking trade networks resonated long after their political power waned. The routes they established between Scandinavia and Constantinople, between Ireland and Russia, between Greenland and Europe, became permanent commercial arteries. The Hanseatic League, which dominated Baltic trade in the medieval period, built upon foundations Vikings had established. Modern shipping routes in the North Atlantic and Baltic follow patterns Vikings pioneered a millennium ago. Viking entrepreneurship introduced concepts that would influence European commercial development. Their use of standardized weights for precious metals, their development of credit systems for long-distance trade, and their creation of commercial law for international transactions provided models for medieval European merchants. The Viking emphasis on portable wealth and investment in trading ventures presaged capitalist practices that would transform Europe centuries later. The agricultural techniques Vikings developed for marginal environments influenced settlement patterns across the North Atlantic. In Iceland, Greenland, and the Scottish Islands, Vikings learned to maximize limited growing seasons, manage fragile soils, and integrate pastoral and agricultural production. These adaptations, born of necessity in challenging environments, provided models for sustainable agriculture that modern farmers in these regions still employ. The Icelandic tradition of harvesting eiderdown, established in the Viking Age, continues as a sustainable luxury industry. Viking shipbuilding technology influenced naval development throughout medieval Europe and beyond. The clinker-built technique they perfected, with overlapping planks creating flexible yet strong hulls, was adopted across northern Europe. The combination of sail and oar power they refined allowed vessels to operate in varied conditions from rivers to open ocean. Even modern boat builders study Viking ship design for insights into efficient hull shapes and construction techniques. The Vikings' navigation methods, developed for voyaging beyond sight of land, contributed to European maritime expansion. Their understanding of ocean currents, bird migration patterns, and celestial navigation enabled voyages previously thought impossible. While specific techniques like the legendary sunstone remain debated, their successful navigation to Iceland, Greenland, and North America demonstrated that oceanic exploration was possible with medieval technology. This proof of concept would inspire later European explorers. The cultural syncretism Vikings practiced wherever they settled created unique hybrid societies that enriched European civilization. In Normandy, they combined Scandinavian military prowess with Frankish administrative sophistication. In Russia, they fused Norse political structures with Slavic and Byzantine influences. In Iceland, they preserved Germanic legal traditions while developing innovative literary forms. This ability to adapt and synthesize rather than simply impose their culture made Viking influence more pervasive and lasting. Religious art and architecture in Scandinavia shows Viking aesthetic influence persisting through Christian contexts. The stave churches of Norway, with their dragon head decorations and serpentine carvings, maintained Viking artistic traditions in Christian settings. Runic inscriptions on Christian monuments combined pagan writing systems with Christian messages. This synthesis created distinctly Scandinavian forms of Christian expression that distinguished Nordic churches from their European counterparts. The concept of individual worth and social mobility that characterized Viking society influenced European social development. While Viking society was hierarchical, it allowed for advancement through personal achievement in ways that rigid feudal systems did not. A successful warrior or trader could rise from obscurity to prominence within a generation. This meritocratic element, though limited, provided a counter-model to the fixed, hereditary hierarchies that dominated medieval Europe. Viking influence on warfare extended beyond specific weapons or tactics to fundamental concepts about military service and organization. The development of professional military forces, exemplified by the housecarls and Varangian Guard, provided models for medieval armies transitioning from feudal levies to professional soldiers. The emphasis on mobility and flexibility in Viking warfare influenced military thinking even as technology evolved beyond their specific methods. The psychological impact of the Viking Age resonated through European consciousness long after actual Viking threats ended. The figure of the northern warrior, terrible in war but capable of civilization, became a recurring archetype in European literature. The tension between civilization and barbarism that Vikings embodied influenced European self-perception, with the Vikings serving as both other and ancestor, threat and hero, depending on context and perspective. Climate science has found in Viking history valuable data about past environmental conditions and human adaptation. The Viking expansion coincided with the medieval warm period, demonstrating how climate fluctuations influence human society. Their failure in Greenland as the Little Ice Age began provides warnings about societal vulnerability to climate change. Modern climate researchers study Viking settlements for insights into human-environment interactions relevant to contemporary climate challenges. The Viking diaspora created connections between disparate regions that persist today. Cities founded by Vikings maintain sister-city relationships reflecting historical connections. Dublin and York, Reykjavik and Copenhagen, Novgorod and Stockholm share Viking heritage that transcends modern national boundaries. These connections facilitate cultural exchange, trade and diplomacy based on shared historical experience. Educational systems across Scandinavia use Viking history to teach national identity while promoting critical historical thinking. Museums in Copenhagen, Oslo, Stockholm and Reykjavik present Viking heritage as source of both pride and reflection. The tension between celebrating Viking achievement and acknowledging their violence forces nuanced engagement with history that challenges simplistic narratives. Modern Scandinavian values of equality, democracy, and social welfare claim connection to Viking Age assemblies and communal decision-making, though these connections are more inspirational than historical. The idea that ancient Scandinavian societies practiced forms of democracy and social equality provides historical legitimacy for modern political arrangements. While these claims often oversimplify complex historical realities, they demonstrate how Viking heritage continues shaping regional identity. The environmental ethic emerging in modern Scandinavia draws inspiration from Viking Age practices of resource management in marginal environments. Iceland's careful management of grazing lands, developed during the Viking Age to prevent overexploitation, provides historical precedent for sustainable development. The Viking experience of environmental degradation in Greenland serves as cautionary tale about exceeding environmental limits. Literature inspired by Viking history continues proliferating across genres and media. Historical fiction set in the Viking Age provides readers with imaginative access to a distant past. Fantasy literature draws heavily on Norse mythology and Viking imagery. Academic histories make Viking scholarship accessible to general audiences. This literary production maintains Viking presence in contemporary consciousness while continually reinterpreting their significance. Tourism to Viking sites generates significant economic activity across northern Europe. Visitors to Lansø Meadows, the Jorvik Viking Centre, Uppsala's burial mounds, and Iceland's saga sites contribute millions to local economies. This economic incentive ensures preservation of Viking heritage sites and continued archaeological research. Modern Vikings, in the form of historical reenactors and heritage tourists, keep Viking memory commercially viable. The Vikings' greatest legacy may be demonstrating human adaptability and resilience. They thrived in environments from Arctic Greenland to Mediterranean Sicily, adapted to cultures from Irish Celtic to Byzantine Greek, and transformed from pagan raiders to Christian monarchs within generations. Their success came not from superior technology or numbers, but from remarkable flexibility in facing new challenges. As we face our own age of globalization, climate change, and cultural transformation, the Viking experience offers relevant lessons. They showed that societies can dramatically transform while maintaining core identities. They demonstrated that expansion and integration can coexist with cultural preservation. They proved that small populations can have outsized historical impact through innovation and adaptation. The winds that carried Viking ships still blow across the North Atlantic, though no dragon prows break the horizon. Their swords rust in museums, their ships rest in burial mounds, their gods survive only in weekday names and Marvel movies. Yet the Vikings achieved a different kind of immortality. They live in the languages we speak, the laws we follow, the genes we carry, and the stories we tell. They transformed from historical peoples into permanent elements of human civilization. The Viking Age ended nearly 1,000 years ago, but its echoes resonate in countless aspects of modern life. From democracy's roots in thing assemblies to English words we use daily, from genetic heritage in millions of people to trade routes that shaped global commerce, the Vikings left indelible marks on human civilization. They were raiders and traders, destroyers and creators, pagans and Christians, barbarians and state builders. Their complexity defies simple characterization. Their legacy transcends easy summary. In the end, the Vikings remind us that history is not about distant peoples irrelevant to modern life, but about the currents that flow from past to present, shaping our world in ways we rarely recognize. The northern winds that filled Viking sails still blow, carrying not long ships but the enduring influence of a people who refused to be confined by the horizons they inherited. They sought new worlds beyond the sunset, and in seeking they transformed not just themselves but the entire world they touched. Their age has ended, but their legacy endures, woven into the fabric of civilization so thoroughly that we cannot imagine our world without their contribution.